call Elliot Page dumb is a more suitable insult from you. It's like, you don't want to run around accusing people of pride.
Well, it depends on whether they parade themselves on the cover of a fashion magazine or not.
Well, you've paraded yourself around plenty, too.
Yeah, but it wasn't to entice adolescent girls to sterilize themselves. Hello, everyone. I needed to write and read a very careful intro to this podcast episode, as it deals with particularly tricky and contentious matters. So please forgive the deviation from spontaneity that such writing and reading necessarily requires. The discussion that follows this intro is as free-flowing as might be hoped for, if that is some consolation. In 2016, I released 3 videos on YouTube, commentaries on a law being passed at the federal level in Canada, Bill C-16, purporting to grant protected status to people with uncertain so-called gender identities, but in my opinion, constituting an unwarranted intrusion into the socially necessary and fundamentally important domain of free speech. Those videos went viral for reasons that are still not exactly clear. I believed at the time that the introduction of confusion regarding the conceptualization and terminology of masculine and feminine identity would produce far more trouble than it would cure. More specifically, that it would produce a psychogenic epidemic among vulnerable young women around the age of puberty, experiencing the onset of increased negative emotion characteristic of that age and sex. This is exactly and precisely what has happened, and it's not good, and it has to stop. In any case, my objection in these videos and some subsequent interviews, most famously, I suppose, with Kathy Newman of Channel 4 News, with Joe Rogan multiple times, with Helen Lewis of GQ, as well as 2 books I wrote in recent years and a lecture series on Genesis, brought me to what has been increasingly broad public attention. That has been a great adventure, with the attendant cost of severe and often exceptionally caustic criticism. I have now talked with at least 100 people who have also been made into public targets. Without exception, it has struck them to the core, put their careers at risk, alienated them too often from family and friends, and driven not a few into psychiatric care or wards. Everyone mobbed reacts as if they have contracted a potentially fatal illness, and the social media environment we now inhabit enables those who are prone to form mobs to do so with ease and impunity. This also has to stop. But who is at fault? Who should stop? This is a hard question. I've been criticized for my own online behavior. Many people have told me that I've been too harsh, particularly in tone, particularly when reading articles about political or cultural issues that have also been typically published in newspaper form. And I have found myself in substantive trouble as a consequence of Twitter. At the moment, the College of Psychologists of Ontario, which is the governing body of such professionals, has seen fit to launch an investigation into 10 or so complaints. That's 10 separate investigations, by the way, that have been levied against me because of what I have said on that oft pathological snake pit of a platform. Now, it is true that such governing bodies have become appallingly corrupt in recent years on the medical, legal, and psychological fronts. Anyone, anywhere in the world can levy a complaint against me as a psychologist for any reason whatsoever, and I have no right to face my accuser, and the college can make life very difficult for me on the legal, financial, and professional front, as they have done continuously for the last 6 years, even though they have the option of dismissing such complaints as frivolous and vexatious, which they most certainly are. But it is also the case that Twitter suspended my account quite recently for violating their community standards, whatever they are, a ruling which I appealed so far unsuccessfully, as Despite the publicity around my suspension, Twitter has yet to respond to my objection. This does not surprise me. I suspect that the formal reason for the suspension is that I dead-named Elliot Page, which is the act of referring to a person who has decided that they are the sex alternate to their fundamental biological identity by the name given to them at birth and used until their so-called transition. This has become a cardinal sin by the standards of the radical gender-bending social constructionists who have made mobbing a veritable act of expertise. My family has also cautioned me against my Twitter use, believing, with some real justification, that it causes more trouble than good. The evidence contrary to that, I suppose, is that I have nearly 3 million followers who appear to believe that my tweets have some redemptive utility, and the fact that I can use Twitter to keep an eye on the currents in the general culture, learn how the platform works and affects society in a broad sense, and follow the activities of the hundreds of so-called influencers whom I have met and talked with in the last 6 or 7 years. It's a conundrum, as I also find the platform stressful, as the comments, often from the anonymous trolls who specialize in caustic, narcissistic denigration, are almost demonic in their destructive mien. Similar cautions have been directed to me, although much less frequently, about the tone I use from time to time on YouTube, often when dealing with an issue that is also publicly controversial. Some of the contentious issues that we're obsessed with in the modern world, such as pronoun use and the associated blockades of puberty and surgical mutilations, or transformations depending on your perspective, and sterilizations, make me both afraid and angry. Those emotions serve as motivations for writing and public commentary, but their excessive expression produces the risk of exacerbating the political polarization and toxic social media exchanges that appear to be polluting our culture to a dangerous degree. And it's not just people who object to my ideas or even my mere existence who are criticizing. It's people who broadly support my endeavors but have some troubles with the specifics. Here's some examples from 2 high-level corporate C-suite dwellers who fall into that category, both of whom watched my recent so-called message to CEOs. First, Dear Jordan, although I agree with most of the underlying substance of your argument, I'm not sure your approach is as persuasive as it could be. It feels more like a mock fusillade at CEOs addressed to your fan base, rather than a message addressed to CEOs which might persuade them to change their ways. In that sense, I am not sure it will move the dial of the debate. As you say, most CEOs do not have the time for political or philosophical debate, nor understand the deep currents that are driving DEI and ESG. They are hapless victims of long-dead philosophers and economists. But, and it is a big but, they are mostly competent people immersed in the detail of implementing, or not, ESG or DEI. So, the way to get to them is through the details of the flaws in the various ESG taxonomies or the credibility of the grifters peddling this stuff. Second commentary. Dear Jordan, when we first met, I was disoriented by your extension of trust. I knew immediately that I was speaking to a real person. You provide the same experience for your audience. It is a superpower. That superpower could be described as a unique combination of insight and vulnerability. Millions of people trust you because they see raw, unscripted emotion from a real person seeking truth and without the veil of a persona. Ironically, one of your greatest strengths is this earnest generosity with, quote, weakness. I fear the CEO video loses the humble vulnerability from the superpower equation. I found myself hoping the non-judgmental Jordan Peterson would appear. Instead, I got caught in a net of angry, sarcastic judgments. Even with the patience that comes with my respect for you, I could not abstract constructive value from the bitter tone. I found it hard. If I found it hard, I cannot imagine other CEOs would respond positively. I recognize the ridiculous irony of judging you for being too judgmental, but that, in essence, is the problem. The reflexive, defensive response to judgment is to judge. For example, the message fails to contemplate that CEOs may tolerate some noise because we know we can act decisively. It also commits the leftist sin of ascribing guilt to an entire group. Your best lectures are genuine dialogues. You're both teacher and student, clinician and patient, father and son. You are a fellow sinner helping us analyze sin. Consequently, the audience is open to the call to responsibility because they trust deeply that you have similarly admonished yourself. My belief is that people trust you because your judgment is not judgmental. Most of the time you attack the sin, not the sinner. I could be completely off. If I have misunderstood or misread this, I apologize. Now, these are very thoughtful criticisms, both written by men who are doing their level best to help me and everyone I am communicating with separate the wheat from the chaff. I have been involved in many discussions recently about the tone of the YouTube articles similar to those that generated these comments. Some people, equally credible, believe that the tone of hypothetically righteous outrage that I adopted, at least partly to harness the anger necessary to broach the topics publicly in the first place, had a clearly valuable place. Others believed, as did the CEOs I cited, that I would be more effective if I alienated fewer people while offering my views. Recently, when reading an article I wrote for the UK newspaper The Telegraph, I tried something different, responding to the feedback I had received. I wrote an equally critical piece, "Back Off, O Masters of the Universe," directed at the consulting company Deloitte, which in May of 2022 released a globalist utopian missive as part of a necessary effort to curb economic growth, to save the planet. I was not very impressed by the Deloitte arguments, or any similar arguments, predicated on the idea that some very real and immediate suffering must be necessarily imposed from the top down on those who are struggling, say, in the developing world, because there is no other way of rectifying the biosphere. In any case, independent of the merits of that argument, I attempted to manifest a much calmer tone, less afraid, less angry. That experiment, which was a genuine attempt to change, appeared to be very successful. I don't believe that doing so softened the points I was making in any real sense, and I produced much less kickback from my consultant compatriots and from the intended audience, who took what I said with more seriousness rather than less. Here are some representative comments taken from a YouTube comment section, notable in this case for its positive nature. First, Mr. Peterson, I still love the videos you've done before and rewatch them on occasion, but this one has exactly the tone that is appropriate to its content. Second, I really appreciate the change in tone. These subjects can be hard to truly hear, speaking for myself, while I do find it important that it is heard. And this more neutral / calm, I'd say factual approach makes it more digestible for me. This in turn makes it easier for me to share this information in a more calm, factual manner. Third, nothing in the message was lost by stating the facts in a calm tone. Thank you, Dr. Peterson, for your effort, for practicing what you preach, for being a good example. Live and learn, we hope. On the Twitter front, things are more complex. I should point out as a bit of background that since I emerged, so to speak, in the public realm, that I have had many good critics helping me maintain my equilibrium and working with me to improve my capacity to communicate. These include family members, my wife Tammy and 2 adult children, Michaela and Julian, who are not afraid to tell me what they think and who provide wise counsel, as well as a stellar group of friends and colleagues who are very competent people and who do their best to tell me when they think I'm deviating, as I often do, from the straight and narrow. These are all people who have some serious concerns about the state of modern society and who hope I'm doing some good, and who would like, insofar as they are able, to help me do better. That group includes the two people I am talking with on the video to which this missive serves as introduction: Jonathan Pageau, fine artist, deep religious thinker, public intellectual, and friend, and Gregg Hurwitz, author of popular commercial fiction, most notably the Orphan X series, comic book writer, political consultant, former student of mine some 30 years ago at Harvard, and friend ever since. I've been speaking to Hurwitz about everything under the sun during the entire time we have known each other, but in more recent years, that has become more political. I've been working with Gregg, with a group of strategists and public communicators for the Democratic Party in the US for more than 6 years, trying to pull the party to the middle, away from the leftist radicals, with some success. He has been a very able advocate for the more liberal side of the political spectrum and has helped me immensely in my attempts to maintain communication with people who occupy that side, whose worth and concerns I understand. After all, don't the dispossessed require a voice? He voiced a series of objections to some of my recent tweets, including the particular utterance that resulted in my suspension, and we spent some active and contentious time privately going back and forth about the propriety and utility of my actions. I then asked him if he would be willing to do so publicly, to serve in part as devil's advocate and in part as a genuine voice of the centrist left in relation to my attempts to communicate by social media. He had some concerns about doing so. Criticizing me, something that is certainly necessary, brings with it a plethora of risks, including eliciting precisely that mobbing behavior discussed previously that is so unpleasant and damaging. Criticizing me publicly also risks exposing the critic to exactly the same kind of criticism. Can Mr. Hurwitz do a better job while pointing out the inadequacies of my communicative strategy that I'm doing when engaged in such communication? Perhaps not, in which case he ends up in the same boat. But I asked him to do it, and he agreed. There is no way to improve without thinking about improving, and that requires forthright discussion about potential flaws of approach, tone, and content. And I found the back and forth that you will be privy to after this introduction extremely useful. I asked Mr. Jonathan Pageau to participate because he was in Miami with Gregg and I recently, was listening to our private conversation about such issues around the dinner table, and had many wise things to say. He acts in what follows more as a mediator and as someone who is assessing the gist and clarifying, and I would like to thank him as well as Gregg for that. What tweets are we interrogating? There are three, essentially, or three sets. The first involves the process by which the nomination of Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson occurred. I was less than impressed by this process, which was initiated, in my opinion, as the Democrats themselves indicated, with the announcement that it was time for a, quote, black woman to occupy one of the highest judicial positions in the land. Here is a relevant tweet from the Democrats. During his campaign for president, President Biden announced that he planned to appoint a black woman to the Supreme Court. Now, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson has been confirmed to our nation's highest court. He kept his promise to the American people. This was followed up by commentary from former White House Press Secretary Jan Psaki, as reported by Reuters. This was an earlier tweet, actually. President Joe Biden stands by his pledge to nominate a black woman to the U.S. Supreme Court, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said. And then somewhat later, 20/22/02/25, from President Biden's Twitter account. I sought a nominee with the strongest credentials, record, character, and dedication to the rule of law. That's why I'm excited to nominate Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to serve on the United States Supreme Court. To this, I responded, once again on Twitter, 20/22/02/25. No, you didn't, referring to Biden. You announced publicly that you would limit the search to a specific race and sex. You eliminated the vast majority of qualified candidates from consideration, and it is thereby virtually certain, technically, that you failed to pick the strongest candidate. And then I capped it off with this when the nomination was announced. Well, this was 2022-02-25. Well, she looks like she can play the part, and that's what matters. Intersectionality rules. Competence is a ruse. This caused a bit of a firestorm, not least among my Democrat confreres, the very people I had been working with to pull the policies of the party toward the middle. Was it appropriate? Opinions vary, as you will find out if you have the interest and patience necessary to walk through the discussion subsequent to this introduction. So that's one of 3 contentious tweets. There were 2 others that we subjected to interrogation. The first involved, of all things, the Sports Illustrated swimsuit cover girl Yumi Nu, a plus-sized model featured prominently on that magazine's most coveted spot. I regarded her photo shoot as a ploy of politically correct pandering cynicism on the part of Sport Illustrated's marketers, as a form of exploitation brought about by the model herself and by those who used her image, and as an extension of the current culture war raging about the definitions of such things as female beauty. And I somewhat impulsively, that's Twitter, made my opinions obliquely known with the following tweet. Sorry, not beautiful. And no amount of authoritarian tolerance is going to change that. This was regarded by some as an entirely justified reaction to some blatant manipulation on the part of Sports Illustrated, and by others as an entirely unwarranted attack on a vulnerable young woman. Greg and Jonathan and I debate this issue at length. The third tweet, and the message that resulted in my suspension from that damnable but compelling platform, involved Elliot, former Ellen Page. I was unimpressed, let's say, given the current psychogenic epidemic raging in relationship to so-called gender identity, with Page's decision first to surgically alter his or her body with the collusion of the relevant physicians, and second, to trumpet the results of that alteration in an extremely public manner, thus potentially enticing fragile young people to incautiously seek the same hypothetical cure. This tweet resulted. Remember when pride was a sin? And Ellen Page just had her breasts removed by a criminal physician. This may be very popular and unpopular. In any case, it is all this that is the subject of the following YouTube discussion. I would ask all of you watching and listening to have some patience, if you will, as the conversation progresses, and to remember that both Mr. Hurwitz and Mr. Pageau were willing to put themselves on the line publicly to help me learn and help me improve my consequent public presentation. I titled the episode with the term apologia rather than response to my critics, or heaven forbid, apology, because apologia has a very specific meaning. Here is how the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines the word. Apologia means matter offered in explanation or defense. Apology usually applies to an expression of regret for a mistake or wrong with implied admission of guilt or fault, and with or without reference to mitigating or extenuating circumstances. Apologia implies not admission of guilt or regret, but a desire to make clear the grounds for some course, belief, or position. The most famous apologia in history was offered by Socrates when he was condemned to death. Defending himself, he turned the tables on his accusers, demonstrating very precisely just why he was feared, hated, and sentenced to die. A more famous missive has rarely, if ever, been penned, and I would very much recommend its reading. It's very short. To those watching and listening, I don't claim to have reached Socratic heights in my defense, but do hope that the public discussion will help shed some needed light on the manner in which I might conduct myself better in such matters in the future, and perhaps have some broader educational and moral significance. In closing, in relationship to this intro, I want to sincerely thank both Jonathan Pageau and Gregg Hurwitz for having the courage to engage in this conversation. I hope that their efforts are understood in the spirit in which they were offered. On to the show. I'm sitting here today with Gregg Hurwitz and Jonathan Pageau. They're two colleagues of mine and two friends, and these things are very tricky. And so the way you think them through is to take a look at your own behavior and to rake yourself over the coals in the most fundamental way. And one of the reasons I like to talk to Gregg is because he's very, very good at making that kind of fine discrimination, and he's a very good advocate for the side of the political spectrum that I'm more alienated from, because they've been after me for about 6 years. And Jonathan is just eminently reasonable in these regards and also quite deep. And so Gregg and I decided that he would interrogate me, that's one way of thinking about it, or help me interrogate myself, that's probably more accurate, about how to draw lines in public about contentious things without alienating the people that you're trying to draw lines in relationship to so badly that it's no longer possible to communicate with them.
It's funny because I think one of the issues is that, I think even for you, Gregg, is that everybody feels like you have a role to play. And I think a lot of this is playing up against this role because you are this catalyst for transformation. You have been this catalyst for transformation. And everybody kind of sees that. And when they see you straying from that role, one way or another, they're wondering what's going on. And sometimes I think people forget that you're a person that also slips and slides and messes up and does all that.
Especially on Twitter.
Especially on Twitter. But there is nonetheless a reality about the fact that you do seem to play some kind of role. And that so it's good to talk about it. And I think people
it'd be good to play it right.
That's right.
And that role should be flexible. And part of it for me is that the role that you're playing has become too rigid in certain ways. And it doesn't
That's the danger.
Yeah, and it doesn't match my conception of you, and it doesn't match what I think is strategically the best use of your talent and insight.
Yeah, well, and so we want to wade into the platform issue too, because like if the issue is serious enough to be worth considering, then maybe it's too serious to say anything about on Twitter. One of the things I should say about those tweets, just to begin with, is I put out a lot of tweets, and some of them go absolutely nowhere, thank God, and then some of them explode, and it is by no means obvious to me in the least which of the things that I'm saying are going to go off like little bombs. And so that's also a very weird thing about Twitter.
So if you were exposing yourself to a more robust range of ideas, it would be more obvious to you, is number one. So it's predictably going off in one way, first of all. And second of all, you and I had the conversation.
Maybe it might be that the people who are responding to it are more likely to all come from one side. So, but your point's still well taken.
Well, you can hear, let's call it dog whistles. And by that, I don't mean the connotation that it is actually a dog whistle for something that is racist or fascist.
Right, so it's not
people
conspiratorial.
hear it as such.
Right.
You can tune your ear to that all the way around the spectrum. Now, not perfectly, but your ear is not tuned to to language that you're using and how it translates. And in some ways, part of why I'm talking to you is by dint of our relationship, in some ways, I think I might be the best point of contact for what everybody to the left of you thinks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right?
I think that's true.
And so, and right now, like everybody to the left of you does not have a high view of where you are and what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And that's problematic because we've spent a lot of time bridge building. And also, that's not you. You're not a sort of rigid conservative. And I don't mean all conservatives are rigid. I mean, but you're like a Northern Albertan outlaw biker. Like that's a big part of your persona. You have a big
suit.
Yeah, I mean, and you're like, there's whole aspects of you that are liberal, and it's the integration of the two parts.
God, it's so shameful.
It is shameful. That's right, but you can only hide so long.
It's like the feminine parts. Too.
Yeah, that's right.
God. Yeah.
But so when it's the other thing, it's like it's not making sense, but you're also not talking to half of your people.
Well, so sometimes I've gone with Gregg to Washington to talk to Democrats, and I've often asked Democrats that I've talked to, when the left goes too far, and they're usually unable to answer. And I've suggested that it's equity when they go too far, when they promote equity. And Gregg has stepped in several times during these conversations when I'm objecting to equity to say, when you're talking about equity, the Democrats you're talking to don't hear the same thing because they just hear equality of opportunity, which, by the way, equity is definitely not.
Most Democrats. I mean, I'm not claiming that.
No.
Yeah.
No, but that's happened. That's happened directly while the conversations have been happening. And so there is this need for translation. Why don't we start with one of the actual tweets? We can start with the one that...
Well, so predating this.
Okay.
So before these happened, you and I had a conversation where I said, you're tweeting, in my estimation, too erratically and too impulsively, and saying if you have something important to say about something, like, say, maybe Islam or like race in America, right? It requires a little bit more, like if you're gonna pick on these like small topics with no complexity, you should take more time and do it as an op-ed, right? And when we've talked about it, I said to you, because you said, look, I've been thinking about it forever, and I said, how long did you think about these 3 tweets? And your answer was about a second.
You know, that's Twitter, right? Twitter is the place to think. And so that's another issue is one of the things that happened when I got kicked off Twitter, I could have been outraged by it, although I really wasn't. I actually found it bemusing, I suppose, especially given the timing, because it happened exactly the same day that I joined the Daily Wire, which was ridiculously comical in some fundamental sense. But my biggest reaction, in some sense, and of course, this also raises the question of motive, is that I was mostly relieved. It's like, I've been trying in some ways to wash my hands of Twitter for 3 years, and then I kept getting sucked back in. And I'm not trying to make excuses for that, by the way. I'm trying to figure it out. My family has asked me to stop using Twitter sometimes, or said that it might not be good, and I was torn for 3 reasons. Is that I use Twitter to follow a lot of the people that I know, like 500 people, kind of see what they're up to. I used it, at least to some degree, as a topical news source. But more importantly, and more fundamentally, I believe that because I have a large social media presence and I'm very interested in communication, I wanted to learn how all the social media networks worked. And you actually cannot learn how they work, and so what's wrong with them or how to use them properly, without using them. And to use them, you have to subject yourself to the errors that go along with them. And so as a diagnostician, because I've talked to Jonathan Haidt and to Steven Pinker about the pathologies of social media networks, and I can't figure out how they're pathological unless I use them. And the problem with that is that if they're pathological and you use them, then you get sucked into the pathology. And so I couldn't just... Because lots of people wrote me about the tweets and said, well, I never use Twitter and I don't know why this is a problem. And if you were a good person, you just would ignore it completely. It's like, yeah, fair enough. Like that's a possibility, but it's certainly not obvious.
I think anyone on Twitter who has a phone is addicted, me included. And I have to...
You said Twitter really did you in during the last election cycle.
I can't be on it in any way. And I don't think you know what you're doing when you're on there. You're talking to troll farms from St. Petersburg, and you're talking to algorithms and AI, you're talking to trolling, like you don't even know what you're doing.
Well, you're also talking...
Even when you're engaging with the people you think you're following, they're not fully in control of why they're in there. And so it's like this video game that you're playing, and in the video game, then you're impetuously engaging in ways that can be insulting without having the humility to come out of it and go, oh wow, I was off in my corner of the internet and I said this thing in a game circumstance that had a real world declaration, the context of which didn't make sense to me but means something else. Let's talk about it. It doesn't mean you're wrong.
There's another element of Twitter too that's peculiar in a very deep and horrible way, is that, first of all, I don't remember how many million followers I had, but lots. And so there are people, many millions of people who are in the potential database of recipients of my messages. But like 1 in 1,000 of them is having the worst day that 1 in 1,000 people is having. And that might be the person who's responding with a comment if they're not a troll from St. Petersburg.
And how many did Elon say are trolls?
Well, who knows?
Right.
That's partly why he didn't buy Twitter.
So you're in there playing a game where you're being manipulated constantly by AI, and then it's the tail that wags the dog. Because Twitter on its own, if you look at the skew of how many people post, the percentage of Americans who post, the percentage then of Americans let's just talk America, because this is what some of this is engaged with now. But then the percentage of them who post the most often, and then what's fake and influence, like you don't even know what you're engaging with.
No.
Well, it is insanity.
That's a huge problem, because it's a biased sample that looks like a community.
That's right.
And it's biased in ways you don't understand.
That's
And then it's even worse, because it's biased towards the narcissists and the psychopaths and the Machiavellians and the trolls and the AI farms. And then it's even worse than that, because it's biased to promote the worst of their utterances as fast as possible. And
you don't need help with that. Like, you've spent 6 years tied to a cactus with the worst elements of the left kicking you in the face for 6 years. Like, you don't need more exposure to the worst of anonymous troll people as generated by AI.
And I can see what it does in the back of my mind. Like, and this is part of the reason that I'm worried about the situation that we're in right now, is that I can see the desire for mayhem emerging within me as a consequence of being exposed to this kind of narcissistic, caustic element that just runs riot on Twitter.
And what happens in part with your responses, to my mind, is it starts to be dehumanizing about the other side, not in a soft, liberal-y sense, but meaning you start to talk about the left as a monolith. And it's like, it's not a monolith any more than when you say, and we should start with Justice Jackson. Because she had one answer that you didn't like. And fair enough, right? So,
well, we could go through that. So I don't remember exactly the specifics of the tweet, but I can set up the context. So when the Biden, and correct me if I'm wrong, when the Biden administration moved forward with the Supreme Court Justice nomination, the way they did it strategically, and you and I had been working with the Democrats for a long time at this point, the way they did it strategically was something like, it's time for a woman and a black woman on the Supreme Court. And I thought, Jesus, you guys, you already hung her out to dry, because the right way to do that, even if that was your goal, was to say, it's time for a really qualified, proper candidate on the Supreme Court, and then to move forward with the search, and then to say, well, look, we found this person, and isn't it lovely that she has these great qualifications and also has these other elements of significance? And then she's set up for success. And so I thought that was just dismal and ridiculous. And I think the way I reacted to it in the tweet, I also think about this statistically, because if you eliminate men from consideration, then you've reduced the pool of applicants who are qualified by 50%. And then if you reduce it by ethnicity, well, in this case to the black population, you reduce that 50% by another 87%. And so now you're down to 5%, 6% of qualified candidates. And the probability that you're going to find the most qualified candidate in that pool it's 5%. You could, but it's very unlikely. And so I also found that, given the importance of the position, I also found that annoying. When I pointed it out, that the candidate pool had been restricted to you, you said, well, you don't understand that in the previous nominations, there were all sorts of restrictions that were equally as intense for equally political reasons.
So let's talk that through just for a sec before we get to the issue of what's a woman. Well, I said to you, you're not an expert in race in America, and it's evident from the way you're talking about it. And you should approach it with more humility, especially as pertains to blacks in America. And I also said you're not an expert in the Supreme Court, like by a long shot. And you said, but I'm an expert at selection criteria. That was your answer. And I said, fine. So instead of angry, like tweet warrior Jordan, you can do an assessment of what has pissed you off about this selection process. But then
it was also the strategic issue, because I was also annoyed. I thought, well, Jesus, guys, even by the lights of your own moon, let's say, you screwed up here because it was strategically foolish. You hung your candidate out to dry right at the beginning, and that was part of the irritation.
Why did you not speak up when the last 3 candidates going through on a short list from multiple conservative think tanks and operation? Like, everybody knows the short list that's being considered by Trump. That's cut the field immensely.
But one short list is ideological, political, and what is your opinion based on my politics. The other is literally just gender
and race.
Okay, so I would argue in some regards, so let's go to that then. It's gender and race. Reagan said he wanted...
Intersectionality, man.
He wanted to say that Sandra Day O'Connor, he said he needs to appoint a woman. So nobody's like home sobbing about that, right? So for a balance of the court, I don't think that he should have done it. I don't like that Biden did it. I think he should have done it the way you did it. And I was outraged strategically, and I was frustrated morally. So you have a list of people who have a certain ideological orientation, and you're saying that's fine. To my mind, the
I'm
difference...
saying it's fine.
No, you're saying it's less.
It's different. It's just different.
Do you think it's different worse? I think intersectionality is worse.
I think that, to Jordan's point, I think it's worse because it undermines the person themselves. It's saying, one is saying, okay, you're there because you have a certain political opinion, and the other is saying you're there because you look a certain way.
It's not saying you have a certain political opinion. It's saying you're on a short list of approved people in a certain way that's acceptable to people in power who've been negotiating this change for a long time.
I have a real hard time with the notion that short list should be composed in any way of characteristics like gender and race.
Okay, so let me just...
And so,
I understand.
Well,
I understand.
okay, so I would...
Reagan did it too.
And
Reagan did it too, and all the first Supreme Court justices did it. They were all white. And there were black people who were here. And so it's not that it's not been done. It doesn't justify it. But what I'm saying is that everything's complicated.
Yeah.
And so if you're an expert on selection, which you are, then no problem. Do this selection and lambast it, but do everybody else also. And put her in a tradition of Supreme Court justices who have been chosen due to different cultural and political tides. And the reason for it is in the selection of her, rather than who we got, who were 3 justices who prevaricated at best under oath about Roe v. Wade. And when I say prevaricate, I mean they fooled Republican senators, unless that's Kabuki Theater and Susan Collins. Like, they were very careful and cautious around it. Or they chose somebody who happens to be black and a woman. They set it up front. I don't like that. Who is a spectacular candidate.
Look, for me, this has almost nothing to do in this situation with her merits as a candidate, because it's possible and perhaps even likely that she's a highly credible candidate. But it's also because I was willing, once we had this discussion, I thought, well, I can give you that. All right, so fine. The previous candidates were also selected from an inappropriately restricted shortlist. Jonathan's point is relevant because, well, that was part of the adversarial political process and maybe still within the game. We'll leave that aside for now. But I was thinking, okay, I'll give you that. I'll give you that she was qualified and that previous nominees were subject to an equally biased selection mechanism. When she was subject to that question, what is a woman? I thought, that question sucks. I know it was a gotcha question. And she could have said, and I'm not also expecting her to be perfect under those circumstances, right? Because that's a lot to ask. She could have said, don't ask me that question. That's an annoying question. You're just trying to hem me in here, and it's inappropriate under the circumstances. And I would have thought, no problem. I'm not a biologist. First of all, that's a really bad answer. It's first of all, because it admits that the fundamental issue here is biological, and it isn't obvious to me that the people who are on the left, who are interested in gender fluidity, et cetera, want that answer. But it also annoyed me because it's like, well, wait a second here. We were supposed to be celebrating because you're a woman. Now, also because you're black, but certainly because you're a woman. And now we're being asked to not agree that there's such a thing as a woman. It's like, and then I thought, well, that not only was that annoying for all the reasons I already laid out, but it was annoying because I thought, well, now I have to sacrifice the principle of non-contradiction. I'm being called upon to accept 2 opposing things simultaneously that are not commensurate. And I'm just not willing to do that. And it's a bad answer in very, very many ways. And I do feel bad for her because I know what it's like to be put on the spot in an interview with questions like that. But I'm not a biologist. It's like, Jesus, Greg, really?
It's a terrible answer. I'm not going to defend something that I don't agree with. But what I will say, and I thought it was a terrible answer, and there's also a way to answer it as a liberal that's way more reasonable, to say, of course, here's generally how we define it. You could also say, I'm not answering it because it's a game. But you could also say, here's generally how we think of it, but there's Kleinfelders and there's variation and there's different stuff in gender and biology. You can say something that's fluid and still not fluid that way, but flexible and still holding to common sense values that the majority of Americans can understand. There's a bigger part of this. And part of it is you're drilled down on your expertise, which is selection process. But you're not drilling down on that generally about the whole Supreme Court and in history, just on her. And additionally, you're missing the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is this. This is a woman who, by conservative standards, by the standards that we all care about, meritocracy, toughness, she's a woman of God, she's been married 25 years, She's got kids. She was the head of the Harvard Law Review. She has more qualifications than are conceivable, that I can even remember. And she's...
Then they shouldn't have hung her out to dry to begin with.
That's right. You know what? But same with Kavanaugh.
Jesus, and how demeaning for her, too, with all that,
I completely agree, but you're contributing to the demeaning instead of saying, wow, here's this thing, and wow, she had a bad moment. You said, and I knew what happened. You were often I know exactly what happened because you sent me all your emails, and there was some idiotic, like, equity proposal in physics grants that was happening in, the Justin Trudeau personally wrote. Like, it was some awful thing in your morning. And you wrote a tweet about her that said, yay, DEI, well, I guess she looks the part. And what I said, and I knew where you were, and I know you're not racist.
I'm no more racist than the next Northern Albertan.
That's right. That's right.
But I just want to interject a little bit, because I think that there's a bigger picture that I think Jordan's coming from, at least for sure that I'm coming from, which is I'm definitely more on the right side. And one of the things I've noticed is that, for example, people get away with calling other people racist nonstop, all the time, in the media, on Twitter, on YouTube. You can call someone racist, and there's absolutely no consequence, there's no discussion, there's no conversation. And so now, I just want to point out that this conversation is quite particular, because Jordan gives out a few tweets that are a little off color, that are maybe too partisan or whatever, and then everything explodes. And the left is like, well, he's the Nazi we thought, he's the Nazi we thought. All right, thank you, God. They're thankful that you made those tweets, because everything is consolidating their image that you're a racist. But I think it's important to say that's also part of the discussion.
And part of the discussion is, I know you're not racist. I know that. And what I said to you was, if I didn't know you and I read that tweet, and I'm not a big call everybody racist person.
I don't know that I'm not racist. What I do know is that I'm trying very hard not to be. And so
here's what I mean. Sorry, you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not racist in the knee-jerk way that it gets applied.
I don't think it's a virtue.
Right, but I mean, you're not racist the way that people quickly dismiss you as racist. Yeah, everybody has to look at ways in which we have biases and where that has to do with where we come from.
I would say in Canada, that for me, that's probably be more acute on the Native American, Native Canadian, First Nations people, Caucasian front, because where I grew up, the fundamental racial divide was not black versus white. That's not the Canadian divide. The Canadian divide is either French versus English, or it's Native versus European. And so when I go to reservations, let's say, and when I interact with the natives who I've been coming to know more over the last years, I carry with me the freighted perceptual lens of my upbringing, and I'm always on the lookout to see how that might be affecting me.
Yes,
and so
that's exactly.
But I don't presume that I'm not racist in some sense, because.
Well, fair. I mean the foolish racist. I mean,
and the triumphant racist.
But what I'll say is, you don't have that, and you don't understand it with race in America, and yet you blithely trotted in, and you did so in a way that was denigrating, that if I didn't know you, I would think was a racial slur. And I'm not somebody who's inclined to think that about people. Like, let's say that there's a liberal who's kind of interesting, who dresses, what is it, tweed punk, right? Like a tweed punk leprechaun, interesting ideas, flashes of brilliance, like you're sort of looking at him going,
Sometimes long periods of brilliance.
That's true, it's true. Flashes mostly, but occasionally a sustained burst. And you're interested, but you don't agree. And the next move that person does is come up to Canada and make a totally tone-deaf slight against the residential schools in a knowing way. I would say you coming into America with your lack of knowledge and expressed interest in race in America, and choosing to make a comment by tweet about race in America
was ill-advised.
That is missing anything that sounds like dog whistles to reasonable people, including me if I didn't know you, to go, that's a slur. And she's deserving of your respect.
Fair enough. Jonathan, do you have anything to close that off with?
No, I think that the feeling I get right now, I don't know, Greg, I feel like we're really falling into a lot of detail and into a lot of weeds in terms of this particular thing. I think my perception is that there's a bigger issue. Like there's a bigger issue, which is the manner in which, for you, as someone who's definitely more on the left, and your relationship with Jordan, and how in his public kind of coming out, you have felt like until then, he was able to speak both sides and to speak reasonably to both sides. And although I think Jordan's probably more conservative than you are, but you felt like he's honest, he takes it seriously. And like the Channel 4 interview for me is like that image of him actually undermining the way people perceive him and
laughing and being charming and being flexible.
And actually kind of bringing...
All of which is hard to do on Twitter.
That's right. And And there's something I think the major perception you have is that with these tweets and some of the messaging that has been happening recently, you feel like you don't have access to that Jordan anymore. Or you can't defend Jordan to your side in the way that you used to be able to.
That's right. That's beautifully
I think it's just
stated.
important to kind of keep it into that.
And that's exactly right. And the dream is a lot about that, because part of it for me is you're not supposed to be speaking in wooden language. You're not supposed to be speaking.
Well, let's go to the dream then here. So this is a strange thing to do in the middle of this conversation, but it makes sense. Like one of the things I did learn as a clinician, and certainly in my own marriage and in my own life, that often, if you are fortunate, during a time of query and crisis, let's say, indeterminacy, now and then you can get a dream. And if you're lucky, the dream will reveal things to you that are part of the answer to that problem. And that's not that surprising, because dream is a form of thought, and the dream thought is trying to solve problems. And so it just turned out that when Gregg came here, he had a dream, which is a very comical dream. And so Jonathan and I and Gregg sat down and talked about this dream a bit, and we thought we might discuss it in this forum. One of the things I learned from Jung, and I believe that this is true, is that dreams are the voice of nature in the deepest sense, and they don't lie. Now, you may not be able to figure out what they mean, because the dream is trying to figure out what things mean. And so you have to translate the dream just like you have to translate a work of literature. But the dream at least has that sense of objective truth in the deepest sense. And you can really rely on it. So do you want to lay out the dream a bit? And then Jonathan, you had some really good...
This is so funny. It's like, it's like for a liberal. Have your dream analyzed by Jordan Peterson on the World Wide Web for the Daily Wire. It's like, what could be a worse idea? It's like,
how could this go wrong?
This should be just fantastic and not at all like self-adoring at the same time. This is the setup then. We're going to talk about my dream with you.
Because you're not in enough trouble already. So, okay.
So I woke up in the dream having left a place that was an idyllic, bucolic, New England-y college, right? In the countryside, green, hilly slopes. And I'd already left there, but I lived there in a dorm room.
It's a dream humanist tradition in some real sense.
That's right.
And you're comfortable there and like it.
I love it.
Because
you
were a real student.
And what's interesting is I think of that as liberal, because liberal arts education, which is the most, like it's the...
And I thought of Hillsdale.
Right, but it's also conservative because it's little c and little l, and that's what they look like.
It's the actual union of the two traditions in the highest sense. It's a cloister where you can explore ideas.
And so part of this is it's like, so the best of conservatism and the best of liberalism, when they live together in that
that's
way,
the humanities.
It's perfect.
Yeah,
it's the humanities.
You bet. So that's where you worked. Yeah.
Right, and so I'm in a forest, and it's dark and nightmarish, and it's stark, and it's like dead branches that cast long shadows, and I'm walking through it.
Well, that's a great image, because the dead branch is the dead wood that should burn off, and it's casting a long shadow, so that ties into the whole shadow issue. And it is dead branches that cast the longest shadows and grip at you when you're walking through the forest, and so that's a great image.
That's right. And so I'd love to take credit for it. So as a writer, I'm like, yeah, it's wonderful, but it has nothing to do with me. But so then I arrive at this place, and it's so interesting. And it's like, so this is all offensive, but we're going to talk it through. So you're there, and you're like hillbilly you. You're more hillbilly you than you are, I should say. It's a different gradation of hillbilly. And you're still dressed in your like, Boston Celtics leprechaun outfit, but it's like
I don't really
degrees.
like it when you reduce Northern Albertan hillbillies to American hillbillies. I think that's kind of demeaning. We're our own
But
kind of
that was
hillbilly.
his experience. That's the dream.
Yeah.
By the way, hillbillies are great too. So it's like, it's denigrating, but like, I want to make sure like no hillbillies should be harmed in the making of this dream, because like, I'll hang out with hillbillies all day. So anyways, but it's like bad and it's degenerate. And you had a great point on this. And you're there and everyone, you're in like overalls suit. It's like tweed overalls. It's so funny. It was so funny. And everyone's all around and it's very like participatory and everyone's kind of partying around. And I got there.
You said there was a deliverance element too.
Total deliverance. Yeah, people are like
incestuous sex. And
yeah.
The whole hillbilly catastrophe happening in the backwoods.
There's a Jordan Peterson like hillbilly. Yeah, it's going on. It's like a festival. But people are playing stuff like a cello made out of like forks and strings and like everything's homemade and it was sad. And as you said, it's like, well, that's harder to make than you think. Like you could try and make a cello out of a fork and strings, but it's a mess. And you're walking around and you're your inquisitive self, like where your hands are behind your back and your brows furrowed and you're paying attention well when you're paying attention well. But it was performative. And I was mad at you when I was there. And then you said something that I don't remember, but it was denigrating to me in a way that it was, I wish I could remember it, but you basically said something that was like trying to call forth in me an imposter syndrome that I'm acting in ways that I don't belong and I should be embarrassed and that I'm embarrassing myself and I should watch it.
So it's an accusation of something like hypocrisy, something like that.
Imposterism. I'm not as good or where I think that I am.
Yeah.
And I was really mad at you. And I was mad at you on two fronts. Actually, I was dream mad at him the whole next day at the seminar. Like
to keep you apart. Like,
he showed up. I'm like, you were the worst. You're like, yeah, I was dream mad at him like the whole day. It still hasn't fully worn off because you were horrible. But so I was mad at you for two things. One of them is when I got there, I was like, yay, Jordan's here. This is going to be fun. This is going to be an adventure. And that's the first rule of our friendship, always. We always have fun. And we always laugh. Unless things are really shitty, and then we can at least make fun of it in an irreverent way that makes it somewhat tolerable. Like if there's a health thing, or like we've been through plenty on both sides that have been awful, but we're still funny. And it still is.
I'm funnier than you, but we're still funny.
Yes, that's true. Funnier looking. Okay.
I have to disagree. Greg is sadly funnier than you, Jordan.
Oh, God,
I have to
conservatism, my friend.
I just don't know what to say.
You're all like locked in. Yeah. You don't take as many swings.
Right. It's sad.
But so you're not, it wasn't like you should be safe. That's not my relationship with you. You're not like you're not a safe space for me, right? In any way. But you're fun and you're adventure and you always have my best intentions in mind. Even when we're fighting and even when we're arguing. And you didn't. And I was like, that's not you. And I knew it right away. And by the way,
that's also what you're worried about at a deep level.
Yeah.
And the Daily Wire thing also brings that up because
That's right.
people have been wondering, what's going to happen? Is this a tilt into something outside of the domain that we've been talking about? And there's a moral hazard associated with that. And plus, they're all hillbillies.
Yeah, it's like, let me insult like a transcendently competent Black Supreme Court justice, like a 25-year-old, like big-boned woman and like a trans person, and then quit Twitter and join the Daily Wire. It's like, okay, good, Jordan. This will make the bridge building aspects of my life easier and to explain why you're not like a captured entity. And let me also do it in unthoughtful captured language, right, that has worked its way through a particular ecosystem. And by the way, Daily Wire, I don't have that bias. Like I've met Ben.
But they're also concerned about that on the Daily Wire front. I mean, part of the reason that we join forces is because they want to escape from the narrow partisanism.
And this is a conversation we could have in good faith with Ben and Andrew Clavin. And like they could be here. This isn't us talking behind their back.
Well, obviously not behind their back.
Well,
yeah, since they're all here.
Thanks.
Peering down.
I forgot about
cameras.
them. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, this is so weird.
Okay, so back to the dream.
Okay, so back to the dream. So I was really mad at you.
Yeah.
And I knew it was an embodied dream because in real time, I knew that it was also about this, and that's really weird. And so I was embodied in that, which was cool. So I was like, okay, this is now, and I knew I'm coming to have this conversation, and I don't want to have this conversation really. I need to have the conversation, but I don't necessarily want to.
Yeah.
Because I prefer talking to you privately.
Yeah.
I think that there might be more good that comes from this.
Yeah.
It exposes me to a lot, which I'm not fearful of, but I want to make sure that it's worth it, right? And I also I'm not certain that this isn't performative in the same way that I'm critical of you after when you got kicked off Twitter and everything turned into like the Kardashians of Twitter who have, big prefrontal cortexes. Like, I don't like that whole game. But so part of what happened was so I knew that the dream was this same thing. And I also knew when you came at me for the imposter syndrome that it hit me and it hurt the way that an insult hurts. Like, it shuddered me. Like in boxing when you take a full blow, but then it wasn't real. Like, it couldn't touch me. I felt it in full and then I went, you're wrong. You're not you. I don't have that. In this. I might have it in plenty of other things. Plenty of other ways I might be a fool or be as of yet undeceived about the ways that I think I know more than I do.
Yeah.
But it's not this. And that's why you didn't have my best interests in mind. If you've done that plenty on things that I don't know, and fine.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
let's get it out. Let's
Yeah,
muck
but
around
that was the fear in the dream, is that I'm criticizing you and not acting in good faith.
That's right.
So we're in amongst the hillbillies partying away.
And you're your focused, attentive self. But as I'm watching you, I'm realizing, one, that it's performative, because I'm looking at it because I look where you look often, right? And to some extent, vice versa. If something's like really of interest to you and you're focused.
Okay, so I got something popped into my mind about that.
Okay.
When I was a kid, I hung around with the more delinquent guys. Not that there was any shortage of them in Fairview. And there was a reason for that. I mean, first of all, I was intellectual and I was small. And because I was younger in my class, I also had a harder time on the athletic front. And so there was a bit of compensation in that, I would say, to hang around with the tough kids, the tough misbehaving kids. And I could do that. I mean, it had its costs, but I could do that. And there weren't a lot of alternatives as well. It's a very small town. And so there might be a part of me too that has a proclivity to want to appeal more to that rough and tumble, working class, rough edge of the world, which I also think is a plus. And I think you have that to some degree.
We do, and one of the things we've been talking about is the fact that I swear too much. I'm a crime novelist,
Right.
And in certain circumstances, it's very much part of my parlance, and I don't think it's as usefully updated when appropriate.
I
as
think
it could
that's
be.
right. Well, I also think that it's been good for you in many, many senses to also have had some appeal to the military types and the police types.
Because that doesn't help with the swearing part.
No. Yeah, fair enough.
I've just learned all the best stuff. But no,
fair
totally.
But so
there can
easily be a part of that that's a pandering. And an inappropriate pandering. And
And I don't.
So
but
the
those are
performative
real,
element.
Yeah.
The dream is putting me forward as inappropriately performative in relationship to the dream
like
character's
viewing the
criticism of
beautiful,
you.
like fork cello. And so I'm looking at it, and then I have this realization where I'm like, Jordan, like the hillbilly incest fork cello, it's just not that fascinating. And like, what am I doing here? We should be paying attention to something else. And I usually pay attention to what you pay attention to, because it illuminates meaning or a discussion point or a fruitful disagreement. And I just realized that there's no life here. This is kind of dead.
Well, that's that incestuous motif, So one of the things Jung talked about, he has a whole symbolic chapter on this about the place where only like mates with like.
Well, Jonathan, you should jump in.
So I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is to understand, let's say if we think about right-left as a basic category, the way that you talk about it, which is conservative and then more liberal and more open. The conservative, they tend to, the way that we dehumanize, we could say, or the monster that we perceive, the conservative tends to have something like a chimera monster. Things that don't go together, the idea of something which is strange, which is unrecognizable, something which is fluid and mixed, and a mixture of categories.
That's what they see as the monster.
That's what they see as the monster. That's what they project as the monster. And interestingly enough, let's say from the left side, the monster is the opposite. It's something that's too close. And the hillbilly has become, mythologically, in American culture, the image. And so deliverance is like a left-wing fantasy. Right?
And The Hills Have Eyes is a horror movie.
So you have this idea of, first of all, you have the idea of something that's too local, something that is incestuous and therefore is too close, you know, and their identity is so local that it almost becomes idiosyncratic because it's so local.
Yes.
And it can become sterile and deformed as a consequence.
Exactly.
And in real time, in the dream, and that's what I mean that it was an embodied dream, I thought that's how I think when I'm seeing the tweets, which is not that it's a moral judgment on you, but you've now surrounded yourself in a hall of likeness that you're oblivious to how you're engaging with the world and the manner in which you're doing so. And you're helpless against even the own pledges of self-control that you made to yourself in your engagement with the world while you're simultaneously lecturing about ethics and Christ around the world. And I thought, that's wrong. And when I try...
Suboptimal, at least.
Suboptimal, yes.
Yeah,
well, right, because there's a lot you do right all the time. And it's like I don't like complimenting you in
That's
public.
fine. I know it's
But there's like at some point, what you have been through in certain ways in facing the absolute worst elements of the far left, and by that I don't mean liberals, and I don't mean Democrats, and I don't mean moderates, has been harrowingly horrible. It's a horror movie as written by Kafka. It's been awful. And a large part of why I've been able to be undeceived about the problems that are happening on my side is in large part because of the closeness of my relationship with you, because I saw it in ways that were undeniable. And you and I are too close for me to dismiss you if you say something that I believe is dumb, if you say something that is misinterpreted, if you say something in a way that doesn't make sense and we might have to argue about for 2 weeks to see where it comes down to. I can't dismiss you for it. And so part of it is I took that ride early. You're almost like the original cancel culture icon. Lucky you. Right?
It's been a pleasure.
But you've been battered and you've dealt with a lot of it way better than anybody thinks or knows in the mainstream media and on the left. Now that said, you also ask for a lot because by dint of the fact that you're an ascendant character who has a religious aspect to some people, has a moral aspect, and has a professorial and professional aspect. And so it's important to say that while we're talking about this isn't like me coming in and beating you like a piñata that you need to be perfect, but it's saying with everything that you are and with the capacity that you have to speak in a transcendent way to more people, you have a moral responsibility to take more care with your words so that you're not thoughtlessly denigrating whole swaths of people who need to at least hear from you or hear a perspective that you have to offer that's immensely helpful. The same way that I say with a lot of moderate Democrats who I think are incredible moral people, the failure to wrangle a proper messaging apparatus, it can be a moral failure also.
So one of the problems that I have is trying to establish a balanced view. I have a two-dimensional problem, I would say. Is first of all, as an academic, the people who are troublesome on the professional front, to me, are not the radical right. Because the radical left is destroying the educational system and the radical right isn't there at all. So that puts me in a particularly weird position professionally, and it's a unidimensional position. But then I would also say that the people who have come after me most effectively and most continuously, although there's been some of that on the right, that's never really been very effective, it's all been from the left.
That's right.
And so I know as well that there's a moral hazard in that it's not as easy for me to be balanced in my view. And then there's one other dimension to that too, is that I don't see the radical left as penitent in any real sense. And this actually extends out into the liberal community more broadly, because in many ways, the entire world has decided that the Nazis that was just not acceptable. But we have not decided that about the communists. And so we still have places in the United States where there's statues to Lenin, and people still wear Che Guevara shirts and trumpet their alliance with even the communist ideals, not working class labor socialism. And so there's a lack of penitence on the left that really disturbs me. And so I have the nexus of those three things.
So that's the left's issue with the Confederate flag. I'm not advocating this, so I don't want to say that these things are the same. They're not the same. But there's a lot of ways that the
fair
imagery of
enough.
symbols move both ways, but it is not the
But
ascendant
Jesus, on the
thing
one
in,
hand, it's
in
Confederates
academia.
200 years ago. On the other hand, it's like the 100 million people that were dead because of communism, not even 40 years
Well,
ago.
100 years ago, but it's America's original sin.
But there's definitely, I mean, the trucker protest was a great example where there was one Confederate flag at the trucker protest.
Yeah.
The media talked about it for months.
We
there were
can't compare
still
it.
communist flags at the counter protest, every single one, and no one noticed. That they
no
were
one says
communists.
anything. Look, here's the hammer and the sickle.
And part
It's
of
like-
it is like Canada is different, and that's also one of the things we talk about all the time. Is it's like Canada has different ascendant forces that are problematic, and I'm not comparing it. And
that was what made it even worse in Canada. It's like, well, even if it was a Confederate flag, that's actually not a Canadian issue. So not in any fundamental sense. And I don't see any sign on the left of penitence. Jesus, it took the social psychologists 70 years to admit that there was such a thing as left-wing totalitarianism.
I know.
And still, it's a narrow part of the field.
get
It's
it.
like, oops, well, maybe it's there too. Yeah, you think, really, you think. And it's part and parcel of the problem of the left.
And it's
this
in
is
the
a liberal problem.
universities
They
where-
won't draw boundaries.
And it's where, yes, but in different ways, the right won't either.
Yeah, but they drew a boundary between them and the Nazis. And the left has not drawn a boundary
true.
between them and the communists.
That's
and I know
true.
it's harder too. I understand that it's harder. I
don't think it is.
I
don't
do think it is. I think it's harder because the thing about the communists is that they promised universal benevolence. And the Nazis never did. No, they said, no, this is for the Aryans, right? And so there's a transcendent promise in communism that's not there on the
That's just
Nazi
liberal
front.
conservative. Conservatives come in the front door. We talked about this last night. Like the conservative gone wrong when they're of the right is a big guy with a club who comes in and smashes stuff. And it's like, it's definable. You know what it is. Liberals, when it goes wrong, is like a swarm of paper-cutting mosquitoes that like shred you to death. And those are the two variants. And if you're one kind of makes sense. And if you're of a mob of paper-cut shredding mosquitoes, they think that's their only chance and justification to go up against the other one. And of course, we don't want either of those things. And so of course it devolved that way, but it doesn't matter that if they're promising universal benevolence, if that's not what's happening, it doesn't matter. It doesn't make it harder.
We also have to understand too that whatever's bedeviling our country, our civilization, if we reduce it to the partisan, then we let it win, because this network of ideas that's tearing us apart has its tendrils up everywhere. And if we can say, well, it's only on the left, then it wins, because it can hide in that. And if we say it's only on the right, it wins as well.
And when you are off what I think of as your calling, you're not being transformative. And what you're being is all of a sudden you're like feeding these kind of red, right, talking points, moving out in language that doesn't sound like you, and denigrating the opposition in a way that I think is bully-like. It makes you seem mean and small and petty and bully-like. And also,
that's the problem with going after a single individual, too.
And we'll get to that with the
conservative
swimsuit.
friend talked about.
Right, because there's all these have different things that I had very different reactions to all three of them. But also what it does is that it eliminates your ability to differentiate the other side. And so when you start ranting about the Marxist,
that's convenient.
The Marxist social, like it's a rant and it's not you. It's like it's captured language and it's like, okay, sure, I can do an equal rant about the worst aspect of the furthest right and how they're racist. It doesn't have any bearing on the conservatives in my community, my friends who were in the military, my friends who are born again Christians. I mean, I can keep ranting a whole list of the worst of the right, but it's making them a monolith.
Yeah.
And you pull the individual into a monolithic thing and you don't differentiate them. And you don't want people doing that with you, and we don't want people doing that with you, because we need you to discern them.
Yeah, okay, so you're called out in the dream by my hillbilly self for your moral failings, but you don't take that personally. And then
I feel it, and then I go,
you dismiss it.
It's
So
you.
that-
I'm not taking you personally, and then that's really sad for me.
Okay, so then there's the next part of the dream, which
The next part of the dream is you're going off with your licentious hillbilly orgy, and people are like pairing off and going to rooms, and I get offered like a hillbilly woman, and it was amazing. So, and I had this moment, like a first reaction where I'm like, I'm married, I don't cheat on my wife, I'm not gonna go to a back room with a hillbilly. But then I did have a second thought where I was like, also the hillbilly women are not very attractive. So I'm like, I was slightly relieved and slightly terrifying. So like it wasn't as purely an act of virtue as possible. But nonetheless, I was like, no, it was clear morally. And it also was clear that it was other in a way that was scary, would be the non-funny part to say it. Like, I don't want to tingle in that.
So you weren't going to mate with what was incestuous.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there was,
and that kind of motif of creative union. So that you were offered the temptation of creative union with what was too close an incestuous bond, and you said no.
Yes.
Right. That's too far. That's a line drawing.
As I'm here in this amazing company that I've been in for the last week, like that's interesting.
Right. Well, because you were concerned about coming down here because, well, this is part and parcel, at least in some sense, of the Daily Wire operation. Go ahead.
You also, I think you forgot to mention that in the dream, the place where you were.
We're getting there. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So that's okay. But yeah, I'm glad you're on that. So then I'm in a house it's a bare house. And the closest thing that it could remind me of was, I went to Albania at one point, and there's these mansions that were built by like Russian oligarchs to escape, and then they ran out of money. And they're these big platform, concrete, like shells of mansions, but they're never given life. And it's got that Eastern European like graveyard of something that would be grand from like the
ruins of the Tower of Babel.
Well, and also like they're weirdly bureaucrat. They're trying to be majestic, but they also could be like the central bureaucrat for ducting, right? Like they have these weird like. Anyways, and so it's a house like that, and it's on tilt, and it's concrete, and there's water that's flooding up the bottom of the house. And everyone's going off to have sex in the various rooms that are also cabins on a ship, and the ship's grounded.
So that's also extremely relevant, right? Because that's an image of a decayed civilization. The house is collapsing, the waters are rising, and in response, everyone's going off to their own rooms to have sex with incestuous partners. And that's the polarization, right? So it's a great image. And another indication.
Or as we call that, Monday night. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, exactly. And then I'm also aware that it's a grounded arc because it's on tilt, like when a boat comes up. I always think about like the image when Beowulf's boat comes back, right? And it comes in crooked. And so I'm aware of that. So then it's a bit of a blur.
Okay, so it's on a tilt because, it's crooked. So the house is crooked, the house is falling, the house is filling with water.
Arc. It's like, this arc ain't gonna rise.
Right.
We need arcs to rise generally when there's a flood. This one's not rising because all you people are off having hillbilly sex.
Hey, I'm not in the dream, wait a minute.
Pageau's getting pulled in. By the way, this is the next icon carving that we need. It's like, it'll be like your Hieronymus Bosch painting will be like the hillbilly arc orgy.
Out in the margins.
Yeah. Okay, so then basically
that's the state of our civilization.
Yeah, it's dismal. It's dismal. Then you come after me and you're yelling after me. It's more deprecations. And it's basically like you should doubt yourself. Like you don't belong.
So you're kind of standing in for the left in that sense. And in the Twitter persona that I've been adopting, let's say, at least in those tweets and others as well.
And at first I had, like I said, it's important. I had a moment of like, taking a criticism. We take criticisms from each other. They're always with a baseline of respect and admiration. And usually the harsher they are, the more it comes from there, first of all. But so I took it like that first, and then I was like, this is wrong, and I'm leaving, and you're wrong, and this whole scene's wrong. I was confident in that. But you weren't, and that was weird, because I was leaving, and generally that's not a place we wind up. So then I went away, and outside, it was sort of an idyllic setting, and then Tammy was there. And Tammy said to me, and Tammy and I, it's kind of interesting because Tammy and I are
Tammy is my wife, for those of you listening who might not know that. And Greg and Tammy know each other very well and have for decades. And Tammy has been in the conversations in many times when we've been mutually working out familial problems of different intensity and personal problems and all of that. So, and I don't know exactly what image Tammy plays for you. I know that when you were first thinking about getting married to Delina, Tammy definitely pushed on you and said, and if I remember correctly, and said, this is like, get at it there, Hurwitz.
Yeah, and Tammy waits and she's all quiet and you're like, oh, what a meek, submissive, kind woman. And then she just like lops your legs off with a machete that's like completely deserved. And she had some great comment.
So she's a good feminine judge.
Well, she's also embodied, she's the embodied feminine in that. You said that a while ago. You said, Tammy's so feminine, right? It took me a long time because my wife is too, and that had very different meaning than how I was raised. But she's powerful from her femininity in full. And so when she says stuff, and Tammy and I also have a affectionate and fun and joking relationship. It's not like it's always serious. But when Tammy pokes
likes you.
Yeah, which is, but if she pokes you, it's worth paying attention to. And she's put up with him for how long, right? So there's
50 years.
Yeah. Is it really?
50. Yeah, I've known her since she was 8.
Oh, that's right. That's
50
right.
years. Yeah.
So anyway, and Tammy had me in one of her dreams. Tammy and I are like dream allies sometimes in a way that's kind of weird. And so Tammy was there and she said to me, don't worry. She said, in our next book, it was another 12 Rules for Life book, we're writing and devoting a chapter to you. I was like, that's really weird, right? Because, you know, hillbilly Jordan who just like was hurling, you know, gnawed corn cobs at me my way out of the crooked arc didn't seem too inclined to want to venerate me. But she was clear that that was something that was happening. And then she said, you're the moon god. And my first I had an immediate and rare initial reaction of humility that was genuine, where I was like, I'm not a god, like even in the dream. And I said, what you mean is I'm godlike in the way that the moon is. And she said, yes, your job is to shine light on the waters.
Now, Pageau, you had some things to say about that.
Well, there's a few things that I would have to say. First off, I think I'm realizing how much this dream is probably a reflection of a lot of the reactions that I've also had from people from all sides, different conservative, is the sense in which people felt like we're in a moment of crisis, and they felt like one of the things you've been able to do is to start building an ark, right? To start build something which would not be completely given into the forces of the destabilization and chaos that are happening, and could maybe kind of gather us together and carry us through towards something better. And so the fact that you have this flood. So we felt the flood coming. And that's something I think everybody kind of feels, the flood waters rising. And so the fact that you see that this ark now isn't going to fly anymore, right? And that
and it's got this oligarch bureaucracy element that's tilted and it's incomplete and unfinished, and so it's contaminated by bureaucratic power
which is also the idea of the bureaucracy is also something that is like a right-wing monster, right? Something that is structured and hierarchical, but it's not working. It's like this.
And it's dead. It's devoid of beauty that the liberals often have a claim on, right? The conservatives have a claim on the theoretical and abstract notion of beauty and creating the conditions under which beauty can flourish, but generally the liberals are the ones who create the beauty. Is that fair?
Yeah, very often, yes.
Okay.
And so then you move out, and I think what's basically happening is that he's confirmed.
It's not exactly fair, as we were talking about earlier, is that without that liberal openness, you can't get access to that transcendent realm from which beauty comes. But as we discussed earlier, the great artists are actually a union between the liberal and the conservative.
Yeah, it's like, what's Michelangelo?
They have that openness, but they ally it with discipline.
That's right.
And so then the proper place of beauty is that place you were at the beginning of the dream, which is that idyllic balance of conservative limit
lowercase
in the humanities
and
monastic tradition.
Right, for reasons that we can discuss at a separate time, because I think that the liberal arts education foundationally, we were talking about this last night, is the only solution for the insanity of Twitter. But
openness per se, which is the liberal temperamental virtue, isn't sufficient to produce creative achievement. It has to be allied with action in the world.
But just like I'm high conscientious, which helps a ton, you're way higher openness than you've been acting. And so part of that, I think, is like first of all, you died twice. Like you're put in a coma, and like it's like we're running out of Eastern European countries for you to go
die in,
right? So, I mean, and it...
Yeah,
it was... Right. And it was a horrible run, and Tammy... I mean, It was awful
Yeah.
what happened. And so
Unbelievable.
there's reason for you to come out now and so there's reason for you to come out now and be unwilling, or not willing, incapable of seeing like a newfound level of vulnerability. It's like you hatched through healing crisis and you have a baby skin on and you're tucking into the comforts of one side more, let's say, like where you're being greeted and accepted.
Yeah, well, it's a risk. I mean, when I've gone to Washington to talk to some of the people there, starting to talk more to Republicans, because I've actually talked more to Democrats in the last 5 years than Republicans. Even the Republicans I'm talking to say, don't get co-opted by the Republicans, because then you're just another Republican, and it's not like they're a dime a dozen, and we need great Republican leaders, but that's not whatever I'm doing, whatever that might be, is just going to be a reduction of that.
Well,
And
this is
but
part
it's
of the
also
diagnosis.
tempting because, well, one of the things I have noticed is that when I'm talking to conservative types, I have to tread much less carefully, which is weird, right? Because the liberals hypothetically are the open types. But when I'm talking to Democrats, I almost always feel, and so do they, that we're both walking through a moral minefield all the time.
Though
and it's
I will,
exhausting.
It is exhausting in a particular way, though don't underestimate the extent of openness and minefield walking for me in my life to be able to get to a point that I'm surrounded with people in a whole weekend. And I'm not talking about my community. My community and family, conservative and liberal, we're squared. It's not relevant. But in a public way of new voices, for me to get to a table with like James Orr and Douglas Headley and Stephen Blackwood, that's not, you don't just roll into conservative town and get greeted with that. There's a lot of...
Coming from where, though? Is it the conservatives who are coming after you for that, or the liberals?
Yeah. Are you more afraid of the liberals that they're going to judge you for talking to conservatives?
Both ways.
Okay.
Both ways. The worst I've gotten, the worst anti-Semitism and deprecation and dehumanization has been from the right when I've appeared with you and with Ryan.
Right. There's no doubt. Well, and I should say,
but
too,
the
I
left
went
is
and
no
talked
joke. And so for me, it's like I take arrows in the back coming to the conversation. The conversations sometimes are difficult. And then I take arrows in the back from them, sometimes going back, taking arrows in the face as I'm going back.
Yeah,
and look,
definitely.
who cares? I'm not saying
Well,
that.
you do care. You do care.
But what
It's
I mean
hard.
is
It's hard on people,
It's
man.
hard. But what I'm saying is like, it's hard to establish a group of competent, intelligent, ethical people who don't think like you. It is hard, but it's still contingent on you to do.
Yeah.
And it might be hard in certain ways that are specific to liberals, which I get because I see that all the time. But there's also different ways that it's hard with conservatives.
Yeah, well, the problem too is you get tired.
Yes.
It's like one of the reasons I think that it's a relief to me to talk to people when it's not a minefield with every bloody word.
Right.
Because it takes so much effort to negotiate that. And I know that I know that it still has to be negotiated because the alternative is conflict and war. So, but the temptation is there, right?
There's minefields a lot, though. Like, I could hit a lot of notes wrong with this group. Not now with, like, you and I have a relationship now that's, like, we understand it, and it's not, and Blackwood too, and Orr too, right? But I could hit a note wrong and find myself in a bunch of where
you can tell that
rebelling.
happens because it immediately descends into the political.
That's right.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, I'm
it's not a good
I'm talking to somebody
conversation,
who I
too.
have great regard for, and I'm like, oh, this is dead language coming at me now.
Yeah,
We're not
that's
in
those dead branches that cast a long
right.
shadow. Yeah,
And so it's hard all the way around. You've had a You've had a very difficult run in ways that are unique to you that I'm not trying to draw comparisons to. But
well, there's a moral hazard in that because it's hard to keep equanimity in the face of that, especially when it doesn't quit, it doesn't stop.
That's right. And so what's hard is then
I
it's
have
like
10 lawsuits against me right now on this front. That's like 10's a lot.
It is. And when you're in the jaws of a kind of Kafka-esque crushing of your, like the bureaucratic state having you in its teeth with this power of the state behind it is dizzying and terrifying and resentment-inducing and outraging.
Yes.
But
yes, and it evokes like a murderous fantasy as a response.
Yes,
it's like,
right.
keep it up, guys, and see what happens.
So here's the transcendent.
That's not good.
So here's what you keep tacking to, and imperfectly is fine, and that's what we're talking about. But what you're tacking to is if you're traveling around literally the world to talk about Jesus and to talk about the rules for governing one's life and navigating complex change, then you should be, I believe, more open to hearing when there are things to me that are obvious missteps.
I should be as open as possible. Well, obviously, that's also why we're having the conversation.
You should adjust to it, and that requires humility. And part of what was hard for me with the pride comment you made for Elliot Page was it was like, you're humble in all the ways that matter to me, but like, you have pride. It's like, that's like, call Elliot Page dumb is a more suitable insult from you. It's like, you don't want to run around accusing people of pride.
Well, it depends on whether they parade themselves on the cover of a fashion magazine or not.
Well, you've paraded yourself around plenty, too.
Yeah, but it wasn't to entice adolescent girls to sterilize themselves.
Well, and the question is that in fact what she was doing? But nonetheless...
Well, that is the bloody question.
Would she have been on the cover if that wouldn't have happened?
Okay.
And she got 1.6 million Instagram likes. And so I can't... And maybe let's talk about that seriously. It's like, okay, I cannot believe, as a clinician and as a psychological observer, that one of the consequences of that parading wasn't that at least one young woman decided to sterilize herself. Now, I think it was likely a lot more than one, but I can't be certain that it was even one. But it's 1.6 million likes, and we know that the incidence of gender dysphoria on the young adolescent woman front has exploded. And I knew perfectly well when all this pronoun nonsense emerged in Canada that was what was going to happen, because I knew the literature on psychogenic epidemics. And I can't see that Elliot Page didn't flip the switch from victim to perpetrator with that act. And then Stephen Blackwood, one of the conservative guys that we've been talking about, president of Ralston, he called me on that, like you did in some sense the other night. He said, you bullied her. You shouldn't have gone after her. That's a disproportionate use of force. And I thought that was a good argument. I thought that was a good argument. It's like...
I want to arrive at this after the swimsuit.
Yeah, well, we should finish the dream, too. So so back to the moon image. So, Jonathan, you had a comment about that.
I don't think, did you mention the moon? I don't think you have... Oh, yeah, exactly, you did mention it. So I think it's important to understand, in a way, the way that I see it is that you feel like in the dream you were confirmed to be what you are.
Yeah.
Which is, let's say, something which is on the left. The moon, in terms of thinking, is definitely the left side. Even in iconography, the sun will always be, say, on the right hand of Christ, and the moon will be on the left. The sun is kind of like the origin, and the moon is the reflection, but the moon is also that which changes. But the moon is change. The moon is waxing and waning.
The moon is the feminine.
That's right. And so that's why it's feminine. That's why it has to do with fluidity and change and transformation. So it's completely
And Tammy is saying you're a valid voice for that.
Yeah.
And that's great. That's a great thing to have happen at the end of that dream, because you're called out by the loudest voice of the hillbilly right. That's the way the dream lays itself out. And then it's my wife, me being the loudest voice of the hillbilly right in your dream, and God only knows to what degree that's true, period. It's my wife who says, no, you're shining the proper light, and it's a transcendent light, right? Because that's a very weird part of the dream, that you're allied in some sense with the moon god. So what the god part of that is the transcendent part. It's the part that sheds light from above, and you're shedding light on the water. And I do think that's what you're doing, and I think you're doing it extremely well. I mean, you're very judicious and careful in your articulation of the positions of the left, and you don't get ranty about it, pretty much never. And you don't get prideful about it too. And I think that's partly because it's been so bloody difficult and because you actually didn't want to do it.
Yeah. But I think the whole...
And it's good that Tammy validates that. It's amazing, actually.
I'm so glad that I have such a self-congratulatory dream. Like, this worked out very well for me. Because if we did the one that shows that I'm like impotent and crippled, and we did that one, and
but it is something to really take heart from, because the dream is very positively inclined towards what you're doing, and it's not that it gets there easily, right? It goes through the whole deadwood corruption of Western civilization, incestuous hillbilly
the thing
catastrophe.
I'll say is that in the dream, when I was joking, saying I had like a rare but immediate moment of humility, I was positioned in the dream with humility, and it's like it's not. That's useful because the feeling tone of the dream did, you have dreams where you're like the conquering hero?
Well, that has to be the case, because if in the dream you had elevated your status to moon god, let's say, by a narcissistic acceptance, you can be absolutely bloody sure that would have been accompanied by catastrophe, because pride goes before a fall.
That's right. And we talked about the great Denzel Washington line to Will Smith that I think about a lot with you, where he said, like, right when you're at your greatest, like, the devil comes for you.
Right.
And so I've been thinking about that a lot and thinking part of our conversation now with your transformation through literal death, it's like, where are you going to be now? And part of me is like, Henry IV's over. Like, it's time for Henry V, right? Some of those things have to be left behind in certain ways. Some of the roughnesses of youth.
Yeah, well, and maybe Twitter is one of them, because, and it's very convenient for me. And so my response to the Twitter ban wasn't of moral outrage. In fact, it was, first of all, of stunned amusement that it happened to happen the same day that I announced my partnership with Daily Wire. I just couldn't believe that was so utterly ridiculous, because one of the reasons I felt that, and we negotiated with the Daily Wire for 4 months, and my family and I hashed that out, because we did not do this lightly, and we paid attention to every single word in the contract. And so we were on board with it. But one of the reasons for that was, I might run afoul of one of these major social media networks, and then what? Then what happens if YouTube stops me? Now, we have backups and all that, but you get the point. And then it was so propitious, insanely propitious, that the same day I set this up, Twitter said, well, you don't get to talk to people anymore.
It's propitious. It's Jungian synchronicity. For me, this one is...
Are we done? Enough of the light on
I think it's fine. I think the dream is pretty clear. I think that anybody who can think, you can understand that it is in some ways a reflection of your reaction to some of the things that Jordan has said, and also the idea that I think you always viewed Jordan as an ally in a way that you tried to navigate between both sides constantly, to be careful, and that you've always seen that Jordan has been that for you. You've had to defend him many times to the left because you felt like you could trust him, he had your back. You're both able to talk across the lines, and now you're like, oh wait, this isn't happening anymore. Like, wait, this is breaking down.
There's a threat to it.
There's a threat. He is moving too much into this side, and so then you are being kind of affirmed as it's like, it's okay for me to be on the left. Like, even if I'm noticing Jordan going there, it's like, okay, no, I can't let myself get pulled there. I have to be able to pull out.
That's smart. And it's like, don't do a bunch of stuff that affirms in its minutia, not as a totality, people's criticism that you're like a dumb person's idea of a smart person.
Yeah.
It's not true. It's stupid.
Well, actually, I don't mind that so much in some sense, because...
there's a positive side.
Yeah,
but what I mean is, and this has to do with your role, and for me, it's like, in your area of expertise, like, it kind of boils down to what we're talking about with the Supreme Court justices. It's like...
So I don't get to say offhand things, even if I'm irritated on Twitter. Something like that. Well, that could be, right? And maybe nobody does.
Jordan, like, the thing is, the image that I have in my mind is, let's say from the outset, you said something like, we're going to create a new university. We're going to create something. And then everybody was excited. And so now here comes Peterson Academy. You feel like this is possible.
Yeah.
Jordan's going to be able to pull the best people from everywhere and is going to be able to create a university where people are able to say the truth and talk across lines, and everybody's excited. And it's like, I am a conservative guy. I'm a right-wing guy. Yeah. But I'm like, I feel Peterson Academy is way more important than like these kinds of partisan, let's say more partisan things. Even though I know that I am clearly on one side. Yeah. So it's like, that's what I mean when I said at the beginning, that this seems to have something to do with your role.
Yeah.
Like that somehow everybody
what do you think about
role?
Dave Rubin was talking to us the other night, and he went after Gregg pretty nicely.
It was fun.
In a very friendly way. But Rubin, who is more partisan and more provocative and plays that role, like Shapiro does, for example, although they both play more than that role, but they certainly play that role. Rubin's objection to Gregg's criticism was that, well, there is a time and a place to be caustic and to be critical and to draw distinct lines. And he didn't particularly feel sorry for the swimsuit model, who we haven't talked about that much yet, or for Elliot Page, because he felt that it was the right time and place to point out that that wasn't appropriate. And there's a lot of noise and trouble associated with that, but that in itself doesn't mean that it's wrong.
And so Dave's job that he should do, being true to himself, is to be that advisor and he's like a general.
Yeah.
He should hold that position for you. He should make me earn that at that table.
Yeah.
That's why he's there, right? And he should also advise you in that way so that you don't tilt too far. And so everything, he said everything, I was like, I actually completely agree with a lot of what he said about.
Well, that's also why you're willing to use wit and humor too, because it's not like you cut that out of your life.
Well, and Dave either. Dave's stand-up.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So,
yeah.
okay, so we can figure that out, even if we disagree on a bunch of stuff. And usually what I tend to disagree with on a bunch of stuff, by the way, is what people say on Twitter more than who they are, which is also worth saying, because it's like, really? But look, so Dave's doing what he should do, which is say to you, like, think about all this stuff. But I see you as having a different role, and it's precisely what Jonathan is saying.
Well, so then how do you embody the positive role? This is a wheat and chaff issue, right? So you're saying, well, it's really good to offer the wheat, and that's the best thing. But then you think, well, yeah, but you have to kind of point out where the chaff is too. But your feeling is that it's way more important to say, here's the wheat, than to denigrate the chaff.
I do think that, but I do think also a lot of the stuff was also about the problem with the particular. Like, I do think that that was part of it, especially the swimsuit model issue, where it's like, who's this girl? Like, I don't know who she is. And then all of a sudden she becomes the whirlwind. And like, we saw that happen on the other side, like think of the Covington kids and that kind of stuff. And we're completely outraged as watching the media like destroy this young man. And whether it in a way, it doesn't even matter whether it's real or unreal or whatever. But ultimately, there was a feeling of that, where it's like this girl, like we don't know who she is, and all of a sudden she becomes the. I had less sympathy, to be honest, with the Elliot Page, because I also think that there was something way more. There was something bigger, because she is a celebrity and he is a celebrity, whatever. Like, Elliot is a celebrity, and there was something more. But the swimsuit model thing for me was a little bit like, oh, okay.
To me, here's the role thing. And I think this is my proposition that I want to put forth, that I'm fairly confident in. But I'm willing to have it, like,
shredded,
pecked to death by you. I think that you can have your discerning great father tone. You can wear that more in areas where you have expertise. When you bring that to Black Supreme Court justice or Islam, you are out of your lane, and your lane there should be as a scientist and a clinician and an interlocutor. But if you so there's one of my favorite Jordan moments was I always put him on a chain with a bunch of people who are different thinkers, and like it almost always ends disastrously. No, that's not true, but it sometimes does. But there's one point we're going back and forth, who's data and who's expert. There's this like mirror game that everyone plays from both sides. Well, your expert's wrong. Well, your study's wrong. Well, you read the data wrong. And it just becomes this exhausting mirrored conversation that Jordan and I are always trying to shatter. But at one point, Jordan said something about IQ testing. And somebody was like, well, who said that? And Jordan was in one of his, like, you must have been in an airport with Tammy losing your mind, because Jordan was like, I did. I said it. I have been studying this field for 35 years. I've published 200 peer-reviewed things. I've created an entire company that focuses on the testing. I've cut the data every way. I've looked at it in any conceivable way. And basically, it is a topic on which he is legitimately one of the world's leading experts on it. And you are angry. And it was like, man, fair enough. I don't care what your tone is. I don't care that you phrase it. So you were like dead on, and you were lying.
This gets us into another problem too, which is if we all have to deal with global issues in some sense, right? Especially now, because we're increasingly globalized, and the globe is tilting in the way that structure in your dream was tilting. But the problem is that we're all too ignorant to do that. And so one of the things I learned when I worked on this UN committee, for example, which was the committee that produced the report on sustainable development, for better or for worse, we like to think that it was maybe a better document. I mean, the people I worked with in Canada, but because we were involved. But it still it was part of the process that tangled everybody up into this globalist utopian catastrophe that we're in at the moment. So in any case, one of the things I learned is, well, no one knows how to do this. Mm-hmm. You know, how do we, sustainable development. It's like, well, yeah, that's a good aim, but the devil is definitely in the details. And so to even address issues like this, you have to risk leaping out of your bailiwick. And So there has to be a daring that's associated with that.
Yes.
But then the danger is, well, what do you know enough about the details? And the answer is, well,
so it's easy.
know.
It's like, what's the answer to everything? Is more responsibility and more humility. And so the further you move off your
Why
base...
isn't it like cocaine and hookers, Greg?
Oh my goodness.
Because you decided to become a conservative. So I have to talk to you like this.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, you want cocaine and
Good.
hookers? Yeah.
What is it? Responsibility and humility?
Right, well, so the further you are off your base, the more you have to be cognizant.
Yeah, well, and I get a lot of comments like that on Twitter, or on YouTube. It's like, well, now you're an expert in this, and now you're an expert in this.
To me, the ultimate
when you see
one of
100
that
comments like that,
was like, it's like Islam. It's like, really, that's what you're going to wade into now and not run it by, like, how many liberals, not even liberals is dumb, because a lot of the Muslims in the world who we need a lot right now are the moderates in the Muslim world.
well, they're the ones. No, maybe not even the moderates. You need the people who are willing to talk. And so one of the guys I talked to was a leader who I'm going to talk to again in the UK in the aftermath of this message. By the way,
good.
So he's a young leader of the more traditional Muslims, and so I wouldn't call them moderate.
Yeah.
But what was so cool, because we went back and forth a lot before we talked, and I didn't talk to him a couple of times because I was sick. And then some bullying came out of that directed to me. And then I thought, well, if that's going to be the situation, I'm not going to talk at all. But then I thought, well, those are his followers and forget it. And then he got in a fight with Douglas Murray, which I wasn't very happy about. So I thought about scrapping the whole thing. And so...
Who wants to get in a fight with Douglas Murray?
Well, no,
Douglas
it's a
is
bad
like
idea.
the last person I want to get in a fight with.
It's a bad idea.
Yeah.
So... But I did go ahead with the conversation, and it was kind of awkward and contentious to begin with. But what was so cool, the conversation straightened out. We had a real conversation. But what was so cool was that, like, a lot of people watched it, and most of them were Muslim, and a lot of them were traditionalists. All the comments were, I'm so glad we're having the conversation. And so it's probably not moderates exactly, because that implies
it's the wrong word. Let me withdraw the word.
Yeah.
What I mean is that moderates who have an interest in free ideas and democracy, like the most useful people for me right now to get a handle on how to fix America are Muslims who, so they're not hysterical when things are happening. Right, Muslims, it's not a monolith. It's like Latinos, right? Like the big joke was that Biden won the Latinx vote and Trump won the Latino vote. And it's like this notion that Latinos are a monolith is in, like, do you have Mexican friends and family? Talk to them, then talk to their parents, then talk to their grandparents. Like, it's a no-brainer if you're off Twitter. The Latino community is complicated and there's all sorts of different variations. If you're Cuban right, anyways, we don't have to belabor it. But with Muslims, there's a core set of traditional values.
Yeah.
There's more of a matriarchy in some of these cultures than we would think from the outside. There's a very empowered role for women to play. And so in the negotiation, Muslim women a lot, they're used to standing up with and negotiating with strong men as one word, but also strong men in a positive way. And that means they're really strong women. And it's incredible level of insight to be like, oh, so you're trying to negotiate the balance between freedoms and law and rights right now? We've been doing that for a while. And so that's part of it where there's an exposure into more Muslim thinkers of different stripes, I think that's very important.
Well, okay, so I'm going to say in my own defense, in some sense, that I was willing to do this badly. Because, like, what do I know about Islam? I mean, and I can't even know about it in some real sense, because it's so complicated. And to delve into it and to become a master of the Quran. I mean, I'm not a master of the Bible, for God's sake, you know? Yeah. And so I've had these conversations that span the Islamic spectrum in some sense, because I talked to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, obviously, who I really respect. She's a hell of a woman.
She's incredible, and certainly from one perspective, but like to be completely admired for her courage and clarity and intellect and strength. Like, it's staggering.
Right, and then I talked all the way through the Islamic political spectrum, let's say, to Mohammad Hijab, who's on the traditionalist end and who debated Ayaan on my daughter's podcast. Yeah. And so I've been trying to open myself up to as wide a number of views as possible.
I just want to say one thing, is that I think that there's a whole
I'm going to talk to Muslims even if I do it stupidly.
But there's a messaging and a context which seeps back in, which has something to do with the dream, I think. And it has something to do with the strange fact that you you sign up with Daily Wire, and then you put out a message to Muslims. And that cannot be ignored, that the context of that. And everybody understands Daily Wire's positioning.
People keep commenting, where's the message to the Jews?
Yeah.
And I think, delete.
Yeah.
But I get the
you
point.
understand the
I'm still waiting, Jordan.
Yeah.
Still waiting. So here's the thing that's interesting,
You guys
though.
can generate your own damn message. Like you have forever.
We don't suck at storytelling.
No.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so for me, the solution is this. The solution is what we're doing now.
Yes,
right.
But how much of that has to be done post hoc? Like,
yes. But what I'm saying is when you say, okay, so I did it stupidly, your humility and willingness to sit here and have this conversation, right, and be
it's just because I think I can take you in the final analysis.
I know. But the willingness to do that, to my mind, is all that's required. And I want to go through the other two tweets because I do think that I would also say, look, there's suggestions that I would have about what type of positive movement you could make on these three fronts. But all that it is that you can progress boldly and be a fool, because the fool precedes the master, and then accept with humility that you should have had greater responsibility, and then you make a correction.
Well, I don't think there's any other way of doing it than that, because you're going to have to foray forward stupidly.
This part has been missing. And it's been a drumbeat of one side of.
That's exactly why we're having the conversation.
That's right.
And so I knew it was missing.
With the Elliot Page front, and I know we're going to get to that in a minute because we still have to return to Sports Illustrated. No, Pageau, you're dying to do that. But like part of what I said to you was, well, why aren't you going after women who get double D implants and enter porn?
Yeah, right.
And your answer to me was, well, they're not causing a wholesale industry of whatever to happen.
Right, but they are fomenting a porn revolution that's decimating sexual behavior among young people.
And that was my point to you.
Yeah,
it's like,
absolutely.
Okay, so fine. Do you want to come in a context that feels holy rollerish, even against something that is fair and that is problematic and doesn't have nuance and doesn't have lines? She's a 25-year-old woman with 11,000 followers. The hard rule is if you have billions of views and millions of followers, you don't denigrate what her body looks like on her specifically on Twitter, which is asymmetrical warfare, and then complain that Twitter's mean and retreat from it again.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a funny thing too. Yeah. The second part of that, I think, is the most relevant part, is because the way I handled it made it look like the reason I went off Twitter, hypothetically, which I didn't exactly do, was because of the blowback from that. And that wasn't actually the case, but that was definitely a communication problem on my part. I mean, it was part of the case.
But you'd already said you'd be off. So you're like, I'm going to be off. I'm bigger than this. Then you came in, and you're like the bad guy in Revenge of the Nerds, like who goes in and there's like the big bone girl having her moment at the prom, and you're like denigrate and humiliate her and then left.
Yeah.
If your point is to Sports Illustrated, look, what you're doing, you're Sports Illustrated. You're supposed to celebrate the athletic body. If she wants to go be a model for the next Rubens, good on her, right? She's having her own moment in the sun right now, and maybe there's some pride in it, but she's 25, and I promise you she's not more prideful than you or I at 25. So she's making her own choices around this and trying to navigate the difference between beauty and self-esteem and, what would you say, health and athleticism in her own life in a way that makes her feel whole in a society that's insane. And the responsibility for the society being insane is partially us, because we've failed to define those terms sufficiently. So she's 25 and confused about that a little bit and taking a moment where she feels good.
She participated in her own exploitation. She definitely did that. Now, you could say, even by the lights of the argument that you just laid out, is that that's forgivable at her age and with that opportunity beckoning, and why would you expect the kind of wisdom that would be able to negotiate that at that age? And that still doesn't justify the fact that you went after her and that you went after her personally.
I think you're on worse ground than when you said it's Sports Illustrated, because part of it you could say, look, let's say you have...
I think this is a weaker point.
It is weaker, I think.
Right, but it's not nothing. So when I talk to my daughter about this, for example, she says, yeah, I don't feel sorry for this girl because she's putting forward an image of obesity as positive, and it's not positive, and it's not.
So were you outraged by this string of endless heroin chic, like white Kate Moss models?
Yes. Because I dealt with people that had eating disorders.
Great. Did you have access to Twitter that you brought the fury of the insane modern world?
That was a while ago,
right.
you know.
But it doesn't matter. You have more responsibility now. And you brought the fury of the world, of the insane world of Twitter, down on her head. And you've had that directed at you, and it almost killed you. And she's a 25-year-old woman. Yeah. And you brought that in, and you know what that is.
Okay, but then I would say, in defense to that, it's that, and this is also part of what gets tangled up in the liberal conservative debate with regard to the moral high ground. Part of the argument that you're making is that I was mean to this girl. And I would say, I think you can make that case. But then I would also say that a line has to be drawn, and it's very difficult to draw a line in actuality without it also involving a person who's involved in it.
So it's pretty easy, first of all. Sports Illustrated editorial. That's one. They're an institution. Second of all, and by the way, she's following around having millions of people now say, nope, sorry, not beautiful in her head. I know that,
but I don't think that you get to say that it was wrong because you feel sorry for this girl. And this is what happens on the left all the time, is that they point to the violation of a moral virtue and they say, oh, look, you hurt someone's feelings.
Here's where it is.
It's but fair. Jesus, things are falling apart.
So fair. I get it. So whiny, empathy, liberal argument. Let me take it out of context. You want to draw a line. Women's bodies, young women's bodies, it's complicated, Jordan, right? Kind of like Islam and race in America. It's a complicated topic with a lot of hard feelings. Absolutely. If you want to draw a line as a clinician and with all of you're starting like a League of Nations, you're a professor at 18 different places, you can publish a paper anywhere. Is the plan, if we bring together the greatest think tank of geniuses, liberal and conservative, and sit down to say, what you should do with this is to go on Twitter and with 1 second of consideration, right, lambast somebody because you're in a shitty mood. Wait, when you said you'd be off Twitter and your answer is, well, the article pissed me off.
Yeah,
so,
right.
So look, and then so you can hide behind all the liberal weakness with all of the empathy, but it's like, look, do it properly then.
Yeah, right.
And that's not proper.
Well, then we
don't
can talk
hide
about
your lack of self-control and your inability to control your disdain for something you've turned into a monolith.
As drawing the proper lines.
Right, and and then call that liberal empathy weakness.
Good one. Yeah. No. I mean, that gets us into a discussion, I would say, to some degree, about Twitter per se. Part of what we're laying out, I would say, is Twitter is not the place for these discussions. And so that opens a broader question, which is Twitter a place for any discussion about anything
Twitter
for anyone?
Is like, so let's say you're, it's so funny because people pay you so many compliments. And so it's funny when I have to in the course of making your argument, but it pains me so much. You know?
As it should.
It's like when I beat you at most things. It's just painful. But okay, so you're one of the great minds of a generation. You have a transformative intellect. You have an ability to frame things in a way that make people see things through epiphany that is altering. We've talked about the difference between the semantic and the procedural and how you get things in a ritual. You know how to do that. If you're on Twitter, you are insane. You are dealing with a monster that you don't know what it is. Clinical curiosity, okay, doc.
Yeah.
Like Jonathan Haidt manages to act like an adult.
But he's on Facebook.
He studies Twitter, too.
I know, but his primary domain, I'm not making an excuse, but his primary domain of concentration is Facebook, and Facebook, for all its insanity, is not as insane as Twitter.
That's true, but also Twitter suits your temperament, because he's got a more even temperament than you by
Yes, he does. I happen to pick the most toxic social media platform.
It's like a video game where you're like, oh, we don't know who's on here. It's a mind control game. Let me go on there and cause 90% of the discourse in the public to be about me playing a stupid addiction game. And the Elliot Page thing, when it devolved into, and I get this email chain, it's always when Jordan does something like what I would call dumb, but call it ill-advised, or maybe other people think it was great. Nonetheless, something pronounced, let's just say. Like all of a sudden my phone explodes because everyone's like, what's this idiot doing now? It's like, Jordan drank moonshine and got the dog pregnant. It's like, where is he? Like, go find this guy, right? It's like, it's a disaster. Anyway, so everything's like blowing up about this. And then I'm on these chains. I was in some meeting.
You really are an awful person.
I know.
Fundamentally, there's no doubt about it.
But so I come out of this thing and it's like, I'm on this chain with like, who are we going to gather up to be against freedom of speech? And it's like every thinker imaginable's on a chain, and how do we get to Elon? It's like, and it all was so performative to me. And then you're like, I'd rather die than take down the tweet. And it was like, Jordan, you're in a video game that's designed by teams of addiction specialists to skew your opinion a bunch of ways and to make you angry and outraged and to make you represent views and say things in captured language that's offensive to the other side to drive polarization further. That's the medium.
Yeah,
and you're a big enough boy to know that.
It really is hard to say just exactly how dangerous Twitter is. I mean, one of the things I've very much noticed is that on Twitter, people regularly say things like, and this just happens, it's constant. People say things on Twitter that are so outrageous, they would never say them even once face-to-face to anyone in their whole life.
Like you to that swimsuit model. You would never say that to a 25-year-old woman.
In my own defense, I would say I wasn't saying it to her. I was saying it to the people who insist that we accept a particular standard of beauty that has nothing to do with beauty in order to advertise their moral superiority at being tolerant.
Great. So you did that in 140 characters well, you think?
No,
Okay.
I don't think that.
And is that like the interpretation of the world? No, the interpretation of the world is she got blown up.
No, that isn't all that happened, though, because there was also... That isn't all
one thing that happened
yes,
is
that's
that...
one of the things that happened.
But you made a choice with 1 second delay. So there's different responses.
Yeah, well,
so Elliot
part of me is saying,
Elliot,
look, yes, but,
well,
there was this subversion of beauty to the presumption of tolerance.
And it wasn't only a subversion of beauty, but it was clearly a marketing decision on their part. They made a YouTube video where they show how they tell her that she's on the cover, and obviously everybody's surprised, and they're filming her being surprised because they know that this is a marketing ploy to virtue signal to the world.
So do both then. It's like, look, for me, it's like, which dog do you feed, right? You have Justice Jackson. She said one thing you thought was dumb. You've said, just by dint of this conversations, a score of things that I think are dumb.
Probably some in the conversation itself.
Well, and me too, right? It's like you could go back and rewind this and write me a manic email tonight and take my head off.
The moonshine dog comment, for example.
The what?
The moon shifter. Let's not bring it back up. How about that?
Oh, yeah, that one. We'll cut that and add. That doesn't need to go out on the Daily Wire. I don't, after we talked about showing greater discretion. But look, part of that is the point, though, because one of the things you said that I thought was valid is you said, look, you have to work up a certain amount of vehemence to go up against the world. And that's true with this conversation with me. And part of it is I was like, look, I can't not make jokes that, I could if I was better than I am.
No,
but I have to get up ahead.
Stop doing that.
And I have to get up ahead of steam.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean I feel that vehemently in some great moral sense. There's tons of, you come back constantly and cut down my argument to size, as you should. But so part of what you were saying is there's a certain amount of vehemence that I need to enter the marketplace, especially newly out of a healing crisis in which you died.
Well, with these pre-prepared, more journalistic pieces that I've done, some of with the Daily Wire, I was doing them before. I read them, and people are less happy about that in some sense, because it's not spontaneous. But I want to think through the argument, partly to address some of the issues we're describing. But then, for example, I recorded one this week, which was a criticism, let's say, of the Trudeau government. And there's like 100 criticisms in the article. And it takes very much effort to lay out an argument like that's 100 criticisms, and then to face down the government in some real sense. And it's very difficult to do that without building up somewhat of a head of steam.
That's right.
It's like, because it'd be easier just to lay in bed and read a Stephen King novel or something.
Right.
Much easier.
Which is like the best thing that we should all be doing right now instead of this.
Yes.
However, I totally agree. And so the standard for me, and that's the balance between what Ruben was saying, was wisely saying, right? Because the point isn't that we cut you down to size and we take your rough edges off and we moderate you. That's what people think with moderation.
Yeah, well, that's the compromise issue.
But we don't want to compromise. We want transcendent. And transcendent is if you think long enough, you get to something that the majority of sane people can agree on
better.
And subjugate themselves to have something to aim at.
Yeah.
And that's the work that needs to be done. So if you take a misstep because you're human and because you're doing stuff that's incredible and because you're under an amazing amount of pressure and because at different times your brain's broken or revved wrong, all that matters is the humility which you're doing to address the complexity of it and not do one of those like hostage prison fake apologies, but like there's a certain set of things that you could do to say, like, maybe you do owe that young woman an apology. I don't know. It's something to think about. What's the most important is that you're willing to hear the fact that you should and entertain that as a realistic option. You can do whatever you want.
I scoured my conscience, I would say, on these tweet fronts in some sense. And I had the same response in some ways that you did in your dream, which was I didn't feel guilty. But by the same token, I didn't feel that I had done it optimally.
Right.
And so, the issue here is these things, and maybe that's
and you
the
can't
sin in and of
apologize,
itself.
and you won't apologize to a mob. If you apologize to a mob, you're a coward.
Yeah.
Right? Don't apologize to mobs.
Well, it also, you never apologize to the same mob, because the mob's fluid. It's like these mosquitoes you were talking about.
It's like, I will outsource an apology to a bunch of people who I don't know and who are not democratically elected as representatives of their party. It's like when people criticize me for something that I feel, it's like, really? Over the, 15 people who are of somewhat like mind in my community who I have trust and relationships with, who criticize me way more vehemently than that. I'm going to outsource this to you, that I'm supposed to apologize to you, and you're probably not even real.
Yes, exactly.
And so that's the specific versus the general.
I have better critics than you. Not
that's
you
right. Yes,
but
right.
The mob.
That's right.
You think you're critics?
Right. Like someone
no
comes
idea.
in. Like
I Jim Keller.
Yeah. Whenever that's right. Yeah, Jim.
Yeah,
with his sunshine and unicorns with Jim. It's like, Jim, tell me what you think, but just right. Try and you need Matt. You need Zofran before you ask Jim for advice. But so, right. And so part of it is that but there are some. So it's what's the difference between apology that's performative and stupid and something that is...
Well, it's the separation of the wheat from the chaff.
And it's also a show of proper respect, which is, okay, you talked to Muslims not optimally. You talked about race in America not optimally. You talked about the Supreme Court justice not optimally. Given that you can't just flee the institutions and only talk to people who've been rejected by the institutions, among whom there's amazing people. You have Brett Weinstein, you have James Orr's not, you know what I mean? But
close enough, man.
Right. But I mean, you have incredible people. We also I don't think we want to decimate all the institutions. Part of it is you want to go back and revivify them.
Well, that's when you get into what I would say is a dangerous right-wing populism. And I've been talking to the conservatives about that. It's you cannot come out and say, well, the institutions are irretrievably corrupt. And that's certainly one of the dangers of the Trump side of the populist right.
So what would be something this is me thinking, not giving a directive. So you don't go make some apology and be like, I didn't understand race in America and I'm sorry, and I'll read more Toni Morrison and Faulkner.
Yeah.
Right? It's who cares? But what you could do is to take steps to ensure that Justice Jackson, who, whether you agree with her or not, and whether you agree with all the political idiocy that surrounded her, and maybe one dumb answer, is received in company that's around you with the due measure of respect and admiration that she deserves, and deserves to be disagreed with on other tenets. That's the thing that's owed for, I think,
you and I have been trying to do those sorts of things where we have the ability, because we've been trying to bring respectable Democrats into the conservative discussion. And I would say, and you can say what you want about this, because I'd be interested to hear, but I think we've had more trouble finding Democrats who are willing to do that than we've been having trouble finding conservatives who will invite them to do that.
Certain conservatives on the invite. I have no trouble with a whole tranche of conservatives. There's certain red lines it's very hard to draw people across to.
That's fine.
Other
and
conservatives is much easier.
I think we should not go into that. So shall we close up with the Elliot Page tweet?
I think that we've talked about it all through.
Yeah, we have.
And I think that, I don't know if there's more to really add.
Well, so here's it with me. I mean, choose your words carefully. Choose your words carefully. Criminal physician has a bunch of connotations. Is it a criminal physician if somebody gets their face tattooed 500 times, if they get implants all over their body. There's a million things that adults do.
That's a good question. And that's a whole separate discussion, right? Because you have a...
Not really, because you're picking one out and you're not looking at the others, just like you did with Justice Jackson.
Well, you can't look at all of them at the same time.
But you look at one set particularly, mostly recently, and it's of a direction.
I know that. But it's also the case that it's in that set is causing a tremendous amount of trouble. The first, look, Greg, I knew when the pronoun bill came out, I knew that for every trans kid that was hypothetically saved, we would doom 100 confused adolescent females. Because that had already happened on the anorexia front. It was like, if you knew the literature, it was obvious what was going to happen. And so there is an element of the argument that's like, well, where do adults have the right to draw the line with regards to their own surgical transformation? Perfectly reasonable thing to debate. To what degree can physicians be complicit in this? Because there is a Hippocratic oath problem there. Is just because someone wants horns implanted in their head, which people have had done, doesn't mean the physician has a moral right to do that. And I know that those lines have to be drawn. And the issue with regard to surgical enhancement, say sexual surgical enhancement, is also another borderline. But there is a line here. It's like we're enticing young people with this fluidity issue. We're enticing young people to sterilize and mutilate themselves. And not just a few, a lot. And the incidence has skyrocketed to the point where yesterday, the day before, the UK closed its primary gender transformation clinic. It's like, so this is not just a difference in degree. It's
with
a difference in
porn,
kind.
it isn't.
With what?
With porn, it's kind. Porn is decimating our culture.
Right.
And
But I don't think it's reasonable to say that I shouldn't have gone after the trans minor problem because I didn't simultaneously go after the porn problem.
But you didn't go after a trans minor problem in a way that made any sense because you
don't know.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. Let's say, like, Elliot Page is not a rapid onset gender dysphoria convert who spent too long at Marlborough School in LA.
Maybe. Maybe.
Okay, I don't believe so. We can just.
And I think you could make a case that he isn't, but
he did it when this was not trendy. He did it when Ellen Page walked away from a lucrative career.
Right, but people can be unbelievably confused for a very long period of time. And the mere fact that it's been a long time that they've been confused doesn't mean that they've thought it through when they make their decision. And I would say it hasn't been thought through because it wouldn't have been public. That's the thing. It's like, okay,
but
you did
why?
it. No
Everything
problem.
you think through wrong is public. And we're having a whole conversation about the fact that you make mistakes.
Right, but I'm not enticing adolescent girls to sterilize themselves.
Okay, but are you enticing when you make that comment about a swimsuit model, young men who worship you and think that you're saint-like to act like pigs to women?
No, but I might be encouraging them to not respect the things I'm saying because I'm being incautious. And I would say even if the first accusation was true.
With Elliot Page? Okay.
Yeah, but it's the consequences.
Yeah.
Here, it's like, look, you had your psychological problems, whatever they might be. I'm not going to argue about what they are. You rectified them in a very, very dramatic way, and perhaps that was your right, and perhaps it was the right of the surgeons, although I'm not convinced of either of those things, by the way. It may be the case, but I'm not convinced of it. But then you made it not only public, but triumphantly public. I finally found my true self, and I'm a model for emulation. It's like, I don't think so. I don't think so.
But if he did, do you believe anyone is trans?
I wouldn't.
Like with all the variations in the world, including some
I know the answer to that question. Someone comes to me and asks me that question, because people have asked me those questions, and the answer is, we need to talk about it for 5,000 hours. That's the answer.
Okay.
Because who knows what someone really is? I mean, none of us know who we really are.
So if it
Do I believe that men can be born in women's bodies? I certainly don't believe that statement is in any way an adequate representation of either the problem set or the solution. Here's an example. Do you believe that anorexic women who think they're too thin are too thin? Because they sure think they are. And I do not see how that's not analogous. And we wouldn't have, we don't
So
yet.
for me, this is where it taxes the personal.
Yeah.
Where I have a friend, a family member, who lesbian, working class, Mexican, really funny, really irreverent.
Yeah.
Went through therapy, master's degree, 2 years of therapy.
Yeah.
Calmly decided, huge fan of yours.
Yeah.
Listens to you every night. Went through transition. Only questions that he came to me with were how do I be a better man? Because I always say it's hard enough to be to do one gender well. Half of us aren't doing it right.
Yeah.
It's hard enough to be gay, and then if you want to switch gender. And to me,
Well,
in this individual,
Yeah.
and I don't want to get into stats and numbers because it's a different argument, and I probably can't keep up.
Yeah.
This person is the fullest embodiment of who he is meant to be, and it's somebody who I know intimately.
Maybe.
Well, as much as you could judge as much as you are, for me, in my eyes. So whatever my opinion estimation is worth.
Well, okay, that'll switch things into a slightly different argument. I'm willing to accept that because I already
if
said
that's an acceptance, then again.
Wait a sec. There's there's contingency.
Okay.
If in finding your true identity, you violate a cultural norm that's so profound that you destabilize the entire country, the entire culture, then maybe you don't have the right to do that, even if it actualizes yourself.
But
I don't know, right?
But is the manner of Twitter, right? Like, how many people who are not activists are you engaged with regularly with their opinions in the public marketplace of ideas? Like, not a lot, right? They haven't had a full negotiation with the American public yet, right? There's no Harvey Milk, there's no Martin Luther King. Like, it's a conversation that hasn't happened.
Well, I don't even necessarily think that branch of the LGBTQ plus community should be conceptualized in that manner. That's the thing that liberals do immediately. This is another civil rights battle. It's like, yeah.
Oh, no.
Maybe, maybe not.
But what I'm saying is, well, maybe, but maybe not gets proven if somebody can come forth who appropriately negotiates with the culture acceptance in a manner that is moral. And by moral, it doesn't mean... So John Lewis...
There's another problem that's emerged out of this that's very, very complicated. It's like, okay, so now the trans community is brought into the realm of normativity in some sense, let's say. And so now, here's where the wheel hits the road. So now you're a 10-year-old and you're wondering about your gender identity and your sexuality, or maybe you're 11, and you're confused because maybe you're a pretty feminine boy, and maybe you're tilted biologically towards being homosexual, and now the conversation is, well, maybe you should be castrated. And the answer to that question is, yeah, maybe that'll happen.
Yeah.
And then there's another question that comes up, is like, so is it so clear that the gay community is better off under the aegis of the trans umbrella than they were under the aegis of the heterosexual monogamists? And the answer to that seems to me to be, not only are they not better off, they're way, way worse. Wait, there's one more thing. There's one more thing. The inclusion violates the ideal and the norm. And you think, well, that's necessary because then it includes. But one of the consequences might be that if you extend the ideal so that it's too inclusive, you blow the ideal so that it's even worse for those who are marginalized.
Yeah.
And I really do think that's happening in this battle.
I do too. And I agree with everything that you've said about the complexities. And the thing that is the hardest is the removal of counsel, teachers, physicians, everybody.
Psychologists who are no longer allowed to have these conversations. And I would say, well, how do I know they're not allowed to have these conversations? And the answer is, because I have 10 lawsuits against me for having these conversations, however badly I'm having them. So now we can surgically transform children that we are not allowed to talk to.
Yes.
And I think that Elliot Page aided and abetted that.
Okay.
And pridefully.
So there's two conversations that we're having, and it's important to break it down. So one of them is in me saying, do you think anyone's trans? There's not a clear answer you can get for that. I have a different opinion that I believe that there are people that is their fullest, most embodied self. That's my opinion. You don't need to share it.
Well, I would just say I don't know because I'd have to talk to them.
Great. So talk to them. And then,
I mean, people have all sorts of weird identities, you know, so God only knows, you know.
So part of it for me, and then there's the whole issue of how it's moving through the culture, which I do not want to defend because I don't agree with it. So I don't want to get pulled into a defense from me saying this of you saying, well, that's what you liberals do all the time. You bring it in and you normalize it and you pull it and then you decimate what the norm is. I'm saying,
there's some advantages to bringing in the margins into the center to the degree that you can manage it.
But what I'm saying is that is a conversation that has gone too fast, given Twitter and the pace of conversation. Like, if you're blowing up Dave Chappelle, right?
Yeah, right.
And Dave Chappelle is like...
Especially for that comedy performance. Did you listen to it? You think he's anti-trans? Are you utterly clueless?
I would never hesitate to have Dave Chappelle at my house with my transgender godson at the table and think it would be anything. He's like the most soulful jester of the court. And you can't cut down the court jester because they're the source of wisdom in saying things that aren't allowed to be said.
Yeah.
And you don't get to cut the line in front of everybody else to do it either. But part of that is also, like with your issue, well, who's democratically electing that leadership to criticize him? Well, no one. It's like, who knows what anybody thinks about anything? So that's part of why I'm saying I don't want to wear and have an argument with you about the entire movement of trans through the culture and all the ways that that's being mismanaged, because we're in agreement on a lot of that. But I'm saying if there is an absolute version of it, then again, landing here from outer space and you get to pick your team of experts that this is something you want to discuss as the most famous psychologist in the world.
Yeah, well, I think part of the moral of the story is, and this might be the fundamental issue, is Twitter is not the place to have a discussion about serious
And when
things.
you said,
I think maybe because we did want to wrap up. We should wrap up.
Let me get one thing in, and then I want your wrap up.
Okay.
And so how you did it was imprecise because it was like everyone was confused about it. If you want a real solution, in some ways I think any real solution has to involve both instead of just like crushing and subverting.
Yeah.
So who would be a really interesting conversation like this one for you to have is if you and Elliot Page reset in another timeline.
I have someone in the UK I think I can talk to.
And you're willing to say, you know what it's like, if I take you at your word, of what it feels like to be trapped in the wrong body. Here's kind of what's happening. What are your concerns?
Yeah, well, that's what I did with Ruben on the issue of gay parenting.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's a missed opportunity to do the thing that you are in many regards best suited to do, which is say, okay, well, where's your line and where's my line? And here's a bunch of concern. And you have concern too if a bunch of kids, if there's a wave of rapid onset gender dysphoria and a whole bunch of kids are having hormonal conversions that are irreversible before they're ready, you don't want them stuck in the wrong body. What's the balance? Where do you think the balance is?
Yep.
Pulling out from the details of the different tweets and the different messages that have come out, I think that one of the things that Gregg is expressing, and I think that there are actually, you would be surprised to know that he's not just expressing it from the left. Like there's also, I know conservative right-wing people that have expressed just a concern about role. And that is something that you have to decide also what your role is, because the way in which many of us perceive you is a role which is able to be raised up above the fray of politics without being afraid of getting into politics, but is able to raise up above the fray of politics and is able to kind of cross over and disarm each side to a certain extent. Because the manner in which you have, people don't realize this, but the manner to which you have de-radicalized people that were moving in a frightening way towards the right, and the manner in which you have pulled people who thought that people who were going also in the left and they didn't know where they were, you were able to kind of tell them, look, this is not what you think. Like you can think certain ways and it doesn't, you've been able to really act as that strange pivot. And so I think that in a way, if there's a lot of weight on you, it's very heavy. But I think that maybe that is what you're seeing.
It's not as heavy as doing it wrong.
Yeah, but maybe that's what you're seeing is you're just seeing this call of people saying, look, if you fall into the pundit, we're going to lose that which we love the most about Jordan. And so, just say, be attentive is the only thing I think the call.
And you know what the left doesn't realize? And let's say the part of society that doesn't understand or judges Jordan in ways that are unfair rather than fair, so negative judgment, is the amount of work he's done pulling people out and criticizing the alt-right. Like, that's been a huge role, right? And if you're on this side of the fence, everyone's like, he's creating the alt-right, he's participating in positive masculinity and enforced monogamy that doesn't have the meaning that anybody thinks that it has. But there's whole podcasts where you're speaking to the alt-right in a manner that is unbelievably critical and offering a different path out. And you had one person who wrote you a letter last time we were there that I don't think you've talked about publicly.
A high school.
A high schooler who literally was going to be a high school shooter, who said, I was going to go shoot up my high school, and I listened to you, and I didn't shoot up my high school. And I thought, and got help, and was in appropriate hands at that point. And I thought, that's a piece of script. Like that, the importance of that thing that happened, it's like, so literally there now are a number of families in a whole community whose kids weren't murdered as a result of that. And so if there's certain things people are worried about, you always say if you're afraid of weak men, if you're afraid of strong men, you should be terrified of what weak men can accomplish. And so that's the part of it. And so that's why these small, seemingly small, corruptions in the facade, where it's like, you're not being gentlemanly, you're not being this. It feels nitpicky in the face of so much of what you're doing, but it's...
No, the details matter.
The details matter.
And that's why Elliot Page and the swimsuit model matter.
That's right.
They're not just details.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And you getting that right is important, because the more that people on the right who have said, hang on a minute, I was going alt-right, I don't want to go alt-right, I don't want to go far-right. And part of that's Jordan Peterson, and people on the left who said, I don't want to go far left, I'm liberal, I'm still going to stay liberal, but there's a whole bunch about him that pulled me out and moved me towards transcendent values, responsibility, right? Responsibility more than
humility, that was your...
And humility, right? And love, and community.
That's what we're trying to do with this conversation.
That's right.
It's responsible humility on both our parts, on all of our parts, is to engage in the discussion in good faith and see if we can figure out how to do this better moving forward.
Jonathan's been insufferable, but I think we did a good job on that front.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Thanks, Greg.
And it's definitely a tribute. I think in the end, it is a tribute to you that you're even willing to do this.
I agree.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I'm more terrified of the alternative than of the conversation. And that's definitely the case. So, all right. Thank you all who are watching and listening, and appreciate the time and attention, and to the Daily Wire crew. That's also much appreciated. And
thank you.
That's a wrap, gentlemen.